I made a mistake, Chisom shouted angrily. A mistake? She laughed bitterly again. This is not a mistake. This is evil. I swear I never wanted this. Chisom looked at her with deep disappointment. You destroyed me. Agnes whispered through tears. Forgive me. Chisom shook her head slowly. I can never forgive this. Silence filled the room for a few seconds except for Agnes crying. There's something else. Chisom frowned angrily. What else? I'm pregnant. Chisom was a young woman in her late 20s. She was tall, beautiful, and very smart. People who saw her always turned to look again because she carried herself with quiet confidence. She lived with her mother Agnes in a small but comfortable house. Life had not always been easy for them. Many years ago, Chisom lost her father, and since then, it had been just the two of them against the world. Agnes was still young and strong, but the pain of losing her husband had changed her. She became more protective of her daughter and did everything she could to make sure Chisom never lacked anything. Chisom also loved her mother deeply. She respected her and always tried to make her proud. Mama, don't worry too much, Chisom would often say with a smile. One day, everything will be better. Agnes would look at her daughter with soft eyes and reply, My daughter, you are already my greatest blessing. Just keep doing your best. Chisom was hardworking. She did not wait for life to hand her success. She built her own path step by step. She had a small fashion business where she designed and sold clothes. Her designs were beautiful and unique. People loved her work because she paid attention to details. Even with limited resources, she made sure every piece she created looked special. Sometimes she stayed up late into the night, working under a small lamp, cutting fabrics and sewing carefully. Agnes would walk into her room and say, Chisom, you need to rest. You cannot work all night. Chisom would smile and reply, Mama, just a little more. I want to finish this dress for my customer. She needs it tomorrow. Agnes would shake her head gently but smile because she knew her daughter was determined. Slowly, her business began to grow. More people started to hear about her designs. Customers came from different places. Some even recommended her to their friends. Chisom felt proud, but she never became proud in her heart. She remained humble and kind to everyone. One afternoon, while delivering some clothes to a customer, Chisom met Kenneth for the first time. It was a simple meeting, but it changed her life forever. Kenneth was a handsome young man. He was well-dressed and carried himself with confidence. He worked in a big company and was doing very well for himself. When he saw Chisom, he noticed something different about her. It was not just her beauty. It was the way she spoke, the way she smiled, and the calmness in her voice. Excuse me, Kenneth said politely as she passed by. Chisom stopped and turned. Yes, she replied. I think you dropped something, he said, pointing to a small piece of fabric that had fallen from her bag. Chisom looked down and smiled. Oh, thank you so much, she said. You're welcome, Kenneth replied. Are you a fashion designer? Chisom nodded. Yes, I am. Kenneth smiled. That's impressive. I admire people who build something with their hands. Chisom felt a little shy, but appreciated his words. Thank you, she said softly. That short conversation was the beginning of something beautiful. Kenneth later found a way to contact her. At first, they talked as friends. They shared stories about their lives, their dreams, and their struggles. Kenneth admired how strong and hardworking Chisom was. Chisom admired how kind and respectful Kenneth was. Their friendship grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, they sat together at a quiet place. Kenneth looked at Chisom seriously and said, Chisom, I want to be honest with you. I like you. I like everything about you. I want us to build something together. Chisom felt her heart beat faster. She looked at him and said, Kenneth, I also like you, but I want something real. I don't want a game. Kenneth nodded immediately. I understand. I am not here to play games. I want something real too. From that moment, their relationship became serious. They spent more time together. Kenneth supported Chisum's business and even encouraged her to dream bigger. You can have a big fashion brand one day, he told her. I believe in you. Chisom would smile and say, and I believe in you too. Their love grew naturally. It was not forced, it was not rushed, it felt right. When Kenneth finally told Chisom that he wanted to marry her, she felt both happy and emotional. Are you sure? She asked him. Kenneth held her hands gently and said, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Chisom went home and told her mother. Agnes listened carefully. At first, she was quiet. Then she said, marriage is a big step, my daughter. Are you sure he is a good man? Chisom nodded. Yes, Mama. He respects me. He cares about me. He supports my dreams. Agnes sighed softly and then smiled. If he truly makes you happy, then I will support you. The wedding was beautiful. It was filled with joy, laughter, and celebration. Friends and family came together to witness their union. Chisom looked stunning in her wedding dress, and Kenneth could not take his eyes off her. You look like a queen, he whispered to her. Chisom smiled. And you look like a king, she replied. After the wedding, Chisom moved to Abuja to live with her husband. It was a new city and a new beginning for her. At first, she missed her mother deeply, but Kenneth made sure she felt comfortable and loved. Their home was warm and peaceful. Every morning, they woke up together and prepared for the day. Sometimes they cooked together. Sometimes they laughed over small things. You're burning the food, Chisom would tease. Kenneth would laugh and reply, then you should come and save it. In the evenings, they spent time together, talking about their day. Kenneth shared stories about his work, and Chisom talked about her fashion business. They supported each other in everything. Kenneth encouraged her to expand her business in Abuja. This city has many opportunities, he told her. Your designs will do well here. Chisom believed him and started working harder. She began to build her customer base in Abuja. Slowly, people started noticing her work again. Life felt like a dream. Their marriage was filled with love, understanding, and peace. They respected each other and communicated openly. Whenever there was a misunderstanding, they talked it out calmly. We are a team, Kenneth would say. We solve things together. Chisom would nod and smile. Yes, we do. They also made time for fun. Sometimes they went out for dinner. Sometimes they stayed at home and watched movies. Other times, they simply sat together and talked about their future. How many children do you want? Kenneth asked one night. Chisom laughed softly. Maybe 2 or 3. What about you? Kenneth smiled. As long as they look like you, I am fine. Chisom blushed. Their love was pure and beautiful. It was the kind of love many people wished for. To Chisom, it felt like everything she had prayed for had finally come true. She had a loving husband, a growing business, and a peaceful home. She often called her mother to share her happiness. Mama, I am happy, she said one day. Agnes smiled through the phone. I am happy to hear that, my daughter. Just take care of your home and your husband. Chisom replied, I will, Mama. As time went on, their bond grew even stronger. They learned more about each other every day. They trusted each other completely. There was no doubt, no fear, no suspicion. Only love and understanding filled their home. Everything seemed perfect, like a fairy tale just beginning. Chisom's life in Abuja continued to feel like a dream, and every day she woke up beside Kenneth with a grateful heart, smiling as she stretched her hands and said softly, "Thank you, God, for this life." Kenneth would sometimes look at her and laugh gently and say, "You always wake up with so much joy. It's like you don't have any worries in this world." Chisom would smile and reply, "I have you, I have peace, and my business is growing. What else do I need?" Kenneth would nod and pull her closer and say, "You deserve all the happiness in the world." Their mornings were always calm and sweet. They would prepare for work together, sometimes sharing jokes while getting dressed, sometimes helping each other pick what to wear. After breakfast, they would leave the house together and Kenneth would drop Chisom off at her fashion shop before heading to his office. "Call me if you need anything," he would always say before driving off. "I will," Chisom would reply with a smile. During the day, Chisom focused on her work. She met customers, took measurements, cut fabrics, and sewed beautiful designs. People in Abuja were beginning to notice her talent. Some customers would walk into her shop and say, "We have heard about you. They said your work is very good." Chisom would smile politely and reply, "Thank you, I will do my best for you." Even though she was busy and her life was moving forward, there was one thing that kept touching her heart deeply, and that was her mother, Agnes. Every evening after closing from work, Chisom would sit down and call her mother. It had become a routine she could not miss. One evening she called as usual. "Hello, Mama," she said with excitement. Agnes took the call slowly. "My daughter, how are you?" Chisom noticed something in her voice. It was not as lively as before. "I am fine, Mama. How are you doing?" Agnes sighed softly before replying, "I am okay. Just here." Chisom frowned a little. "Just here? What do you mean?" Agnes paused for a moment and then said, "The house is quiet. It is just me alone every day. I wake up, cook, sit down, watch television and sleep. Sometimes I don't even feel like cooking." Chisom's heart became heavy. She adjusted her sitting position and said, "Mama, you should try to go out sometimes, visit neighbors or do something to keep yourself busy." Agnes gave a small laugh, but it sounded empty. "My daughter, it is not that easy. When your father was alive, the house was full of life. Now it feels like something is missing." Chisom swallowed hard. She missed her father too, but she tried to stay strong. "Mama, don't worry. Things will get better." "I hope so," Agnes replied softly. After the call ended, Chisom sat quietly for a while, thinking deeply. When Kenneth came back that evening, he noticed her mood immediately. "What is wrong?" he asked as he dropped his bag. Chisom looked at him and said, "I just spoke with my mother." Kenneth nodded. "Is she okay?" Chisom sighed. "She's fine, but she is lonely, very lonely." Kenneth sat beside her. "That is normal. She lives alone." Chisom shook her head gently. "It is more than that. I can hear it in her voice. She is not happy." Kenneth placed his hand on hers. "What do you want to do?" Chisom hesitated for a moment and then said, "I have been thinking, what if we bring her here to Abuja? She can stay with us." Kenneth was silent for a few seconds. "Stay with us?" Chisom nodded quickly. "Yes, she can live with us. At least she won't be alone anymore. She can even start a small business around here to keep herself busy." Kenneth leaned back and took a deep breath. Chisom noticed his hesitation and said softly, "Please think about it. She is my mother. I cannot just leave her there like that." Kenneth looked at her carefully. "I understand, but this is our home. Bringing another person into the house would change things." Chisom nodded slowly. "I know, but she will not be a burden. She is very calm and respectful. She will even help around the house." Kenneth rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It is not about being a burden. It is about adjustment. Marriage needs space." Chisom moved closer to him. "We will still have our space. Please, Kenneth, I just want my mother to be happy." Kenneth looked at her face and saw how serious she was. He sighed again and said, "Let me think about it." That night, Chisom could not sleep well. She kept thinking about her mother sitting alone in that quiet house. The next morning, Chisom called Agnes again. "Mama, how are you today?" Agnes replied, "I am fine, my daughter." Chisom hesitated and then said, "Mama, have you ever thought about coming to Abuja to stay with me?" There was a short silence on the phone. Agnes then said, "Stay with you?" Chisom nodded, even though her mother could not see her. "Yes, you can come and live with us. At least you will not be alone." Agnes sounded surprised. "Are you sure your husband will agree?" Chisom said quickly, "I am discussing it with him. I just wanted to know if you would like the idea." Agnes sighed softly. "My daughter, I don't want to cause any problem in your marriage." Chisom shook her head. "You will not cause any problem. You are my mother." Agnes's voice became emotional. "If it is possible, I would love to be closer to you." Chisom smiled. "Then don't worry, I will talk to Kenneth again." Later that evening, Chisom brought up the topic again. "Kenneth, have you thought about what I said?" Kenneth looked at her and said, "Yes, I have." Chisom waited anxiously. "And?" Kenneth sighed. "I am still thinking about it." Chisom held his hand gently. "Please try to understand me. If it were your mother, I would support you." Kenneth looked at her deeply. "You are right." He paused and then added, "But I want to be sure this will not affect our peace." Chisom nodded quickly. "It will not, I promise." Kenneth looked away for a moment, then back at her. Okay. Chisom's eyes widened. Okay. Kenneth nodded. Yes, she can come and stay with us. Chisom jumped up happily. Thank you so much. She hugged him tightly. You have no idea how much this means to me. Kenneth smiled faintly. I just hope it will be a good decision. Chisom pulled back and looked at him. It will be, I promise. That night, Chisom called her mother again with excitement in her voice. Mama, Agnes answered quickly. Yes, my daughter. Chisom could not hide her joy. Start preparing. You are coming to Abuja. Agnes was silent for a moment, then said, Really? Chisom laughed softly. Yes, Kenneth has agreed. Agnes's voice became filled with emotion. God bless you, my daughter. God bless your husband. Chisom smiled. We are waiting for you. After the call, Chisom felt a deep sense of happiness. She believed she had made the right decision. She believed she was bringing love, unity, and happiness into her home. She believed she was building a stronger family bond. Chisom could not hide her excitement from the day her mother, Agnes, told her the exact date she would arrive in Abuja. From that moment, she started preparing the house with so much joy and energy. She cleaned every corner carefully, arranged the sitting room neatly, and even bought new curtains to make the house look fresh and welcoming. One evening, as she was wiping the table, Kenneth walked in and smiled. You have been cleaning since morning. What is going on? Chisom laughed and said, Mama is coming. Everything must be perfect. Kenneth nodded and dropped his bag. It already looks perfect. Chisom shook her head. No, I want her to feel comfortable. This is her home too now. Kenneth walked closer and said gently, I understand. Just don't stress yourself too much. Chisom smiled. I won't. The next day, she went to the market to buy foodstuff and some household items. She bought fresh vegetables, rice, meat, and everything she knew her mother loved. When she returned home, she started cooking. The kitchen was filled with the sweet smell of delicious food. Kenneth came in later and said, Wow, what is all this? Chisom laughed. Welcome food for Mama. Kenneth smiled. Then I am lucky too. The day Agnes arrived, Chisom woke up very early. She could not even sleep well the night before because of excitement. She kept checking the time. When it was finally time to go to the bus park, she dressed quickly and told Kenneth, Let's go. I don't want her to wait. Kenneth smiled calmly. Relax, we will get there on time. When they arrived at the park, Chisom's eyes kept searching everywhere. Finally, she saw her mother coming down from the bus with a small bag in her hand. Mama! Chisom shouted happily as she ran toward her. Agnes smiled widely and opened her arms. They hugged tightly. My daughter, Agnes said with joy, I have missed you so much. Chisom held her hand. I have missed you too, Mama. Kenneth walked closer and greeted respectfully. Welcome, Mama. Agnes smiled warmly. Thank you, my son. They helped her with her bag and drove home together. Inside the car, Agnes looked around and said, Abuja is very beautiful. Chisom nodded proudly. Yes, Mama, and now this is your home too. When they got home, Agnes stepped inside and looked around carefully. The house was neat and well arranged. This place is very nice, she said. Chisom smiled. I prepared everything for you. Agnes touched her daughter's cheek gently. God bless you. Kenneth added, Feel free, Mama. This is your home. Agnes nodded. Thank you. From that day, their home felt fuller and more lively. Agnes quickly settled in. She arranged her room and made herself comfortable. Every morning, she would wake up early before Chisom and Kenneth. She would sweep the house, clean the kitchen, and prepare breakfast. One morning, Chisom came out and saw everything already done. Mama, why are you stressing yourself like this? She said. Agnes smiled. I am not stressing. I just want to help. Chisom hugged her. Thank you, Mama. Kenneth also noticed the changes. One morning, he sat at the dining table and said, Mama, this food is very delicious. Agnes smiled. Eat well, my son. Kenneth laughed. If I continue eating like this, I will become very big. They all laughed together. Their mornings became more lively. They would sit together, eat, and talk before going out for the day. Sometimes Agnes would give them advice. Always respect each other, she would say. Marriage needs patience. Chisom would nod, yes, Mama. Kenneth would add, we will always listen to you. During the day, Agnes stayed at home. She watched television, cleaned the house, and sometimes went outside to greet neighbors. She also started learning small things she could sell later. She would say, "I don't want to just sit at home. I want to do something." Chisom encouraged her. "Yes, Mama, we will find something for you." Meanwhile, Chisom continued to focus on her fashion business. Her shop was doing well and more customers were coming. She would come home in the evening tired but happy. Agnes would welcome her with a smile. "Welcome, my daughter." Chisom would drop her bag and hug her. "Mama, I am tired." Agnes would laugh softly. "Come and eat first, then you will feel better." Kenneth also worked hard at his company. He was respected by his colleagues and was doing very well. When he came home, Agnes always made sure he was comfortable. "Welcome, my son," she would say. Kenneth would reply, "Thank you, Mama." In the evenings, they all sat together in the living room. Sometimes they watched television, sometimes they talked and laughed. Chisom would share stories about her customers. "Today, one woman came and said she wants a dress that will make everybody look at her," she said one evening. Kenneth laughed. "And what did you tell her?" Chisom smiled. "I told her she came to the right place." Agnes laughed too. "That is my daughter." Other times, Kenneth would talk about his work. "Today was very stressful," he said one evening. Agnes looked at him kindly. "You need to rest well." Chisom added, "Yes, don't worry too much." Their conversations were always warm and friendly. The house was filled with laughter and peace. On weekends, they spent more time together. Sometimes they cooked together. One Saturday, Agnes was in the kitchen preparing food when Chisom joined her. "Mama, teach me this recipe," Chisom said. Agnes smiled. "Come, I will show you." Kenneth walked in and said jokingly, "So today I will eat special food." Chisom laughed. "Yes, but you must help us too." Kenneth shook his head. "I will only help by eating." They all laughed again. After cooking, they sat together and enjoyed the meal. "This is very nice," Kenneth said. Agnes smiled proudly. "Of course." Chisom looked around and felt happy. She felt complete. She felt like she had everything she ever wanted. One evening, as she sat quietly, she said to herself, "I made the right decision." Later that night, she said it out loud to Kenneth. "Thank you for agreeing to bring my mother here," she said. Kenneth looked at her and smiled. "I can see how happy you are. That is enough for me." Chisom held his hand. "I am very happy." Agnes also felt grateful. One day she said to Chisom, "My daughter, thank you for bringing me here. I am no longer lonely." Chisom smiled. "That is all I wanted." Agnes added, "You have a good husband. Take care of your home." Chisom nodded. "I will, Mama." Everything in their home felt balanced and peaceful. There was love, respect, and understanding. They lived like a happy family, sharing meals, laughter, and daily life together. Agnes was always present, caring, and supportive, just like a mother should be. And as Chisom looked at her life, she felt fulfilled, believing she had truly made the right decision. As the weeks turned into months, life in the house continued to look peaceful on the outside, but slowly, quietly, small changes began to show. Changes so little that at first, nobody paid serious attention to them, especially not Chisom, who still believed her home was built on love and trust. Every morning still started the same way, with Agnes waking up early, cleaning the house, and preparing food, while Chisom and Kenneth got ready for work, talking and laughing as usual. But something had started to change in their daily routine without Chisom fully noticing it. Kenneth's schedule at work began to shift, and sometimes he would return home earlier than expected, especially on days when Chisom stayed longer at her fashion shop to meet customers or finish urgent designs. The first time it happened, it did not mean anything. Kenneth walked into the house earlier than usual, dropped his bag and called out, "Mama, I am back." Agnes came out of the kitchen and smiled. "Welcome, my son. You are back early today." Kenneth stretched his body and sat down. "Yes, work was not too much today." Agnes nodded. "That is good. You should rest." Kenneth looked around. "Where is Chisom?" Agnes replied. "She said she will close late today. She has many customers." Kenneth smiled. "That is good for her business." Agnes brought him water and sat down nearby. "You are working too hard. You need to take care of yourself." Kenneth laughed lightly. Mama, if I don't work hard, who will take care of this house? Agnes smiled softly. You are doing well. I am proud of you. That simple conversation lasted longer than expected. They talked about many things, about work, about life, about how the city was different from where Agnes came from. They laughed at small jokes. When Chisom finally came home that evening, she saw them sitting together, smiling. You people are enjoying without me, she said jokingly. Kenneth laughed. We were just talking, Agnes added. Come and sit, you look tired. Chisom smiled and joined them. Everything felt normal. Nothing seemed wrong. Days passed and the same thing began to happen more often. Kenneth would come home early and Agnes would be there. They would talk, sometimes watch television together, sometimes share stories from the past. One afternoon, Kenneth came home tired and sat on the chair. Agnes noticed and said, You look stressed. Kenneth sighed. Work is becoming too much. Agnes walked closer and said gently, Don't worry too much. Everything will be fine. Kenneth looked at her and smiled. Thank you, Mama. Talking to you makes me feel better. Agnes smiled back. That is what I am here for. They both laughed softly. It became a pattern. Kenneth found comfort in talking to Agnes, and Agnes enjoyed having someone to talk to during the day. She no longer felt lonely like before. One day, Agnes said, Before I came here, I was always alone. Now I feel alive again. Kenneth nodded. That is good. Nobody deserves to be lonely. Agnes looked at him and said, You are a good man. Kenneth smiled. Thank you. Meanwhile, Chisom remained busy with her business. Her shop was growing and she had more responsibilities. Sometimes she stayed late, sometimes she traveled to get materials. Each time she came back, she found Kenneth and Agnes already together in the living room, talking or watching television. At first, she felt happy seeing them get along. One evening, she said, I am glad both of you are close. It makes me feel at peace. Kenneth replied, Why won't we be close? She is like my mother too. Agnes laughed softly. Yes, he is like my son. Chisom smiled, feeling proud of the bond they were building. However, as time went on, their closeness began to grow stronger in a way that was slightly different, though still not obvious. They began to share more personal conversations. Kenneth would talk about his worries, his stress, even things he did not tell Chisom immediately. Agnes would listen carefully and give advice. Sometimes, women don't understand everything men go through, she said one day. Kenneth nodded slowly. That is true. Agnes continued, You just need someone who listens. Kenneth looked at her and said, You listen very well. Agnes smiled. That is because I have seen life. They both laughed quietly. One evening, Kenneth came home and did not meet Chisom. He called her. Where are you? Chisom replied, I am still at the shop. I have work to finish. Kenneth said, Okay, take your time. One evening, Chisom sat quietly and watched them from a distance as they talked. Something about their closeness caught her attention for a brief moment. She said softly, You two are becoming very close. Kenneth laughed. Is that a problem? Chisom quickly shook her head. No, not at all. I am happy. Agnes added, We are just keeping each other company. Chisom smiled. That is good. Deep down, a small thought tried to form in her mind, but she pushed it away immediately. She trusted both of them completely. She believed in her husband. She believed in her mother. She told herself, there is nothing wrong. This is just family bonding. And so she ignored every small sign, every little change, every unusual moment. She never imagined, not even for 1 second, that anything inappropriate could happen under her own roof. Life in the house continued peacefully on the surface, but slowly, things began to change in ways Chisom could not fully explain. At first, the changes were very small, almost impossible to notice, but as the days passed, they became clearer little by little. Kenneth was no longer behaving the same way he used to. The sweet and loving husband who once rushed to hug her whenever she returned from work was slowly becoming cold and distant. In the beginning, Chisom ignored it because she believed every marriage had moments like that. She told herself that maybe he was just stressed from work. Kenneth's company had been very busy lately, and he often complained about pressure from his office. So whenever she noticed his strange behavior, she quickly made excuses for him in her heart. One evening, Chisom returned home tired after spending the whole day attending to customers at her fashion shop. As she entered the sitting room, she saw Kenneth sitting quietly with his phone in his hand while Agnes watched television nearby. "Good evening," Chisom said with a smile as she dropped her handbag on the chair. Agnes smiled warmly. "Welcome, my daughter." Kenneth looked up briefly. "Welcome," he said calmly before looking back at his phone. Chisom paused for a second because normally Kenneth would stand up, hug her, or at least ask how her day went. But that evening, he remained where he was. Chisom forced a smile and sat down beside him. "How was work today?" she asked softly. Kenneth shrugged. "Stressful." Chisom nodded. "Sorry about that." Kenneth only hummed quietly. Agnes quickly spoke up to break the silence. "Come and eat first before your food gets cold." Chisom stood up slowly and went to wash her hands, but deep inside she felt something strange. Still, she brushed it aside. "He's just tired," she told herself. Later that night, while they were in the bedroom, Chisom moved closer to Kenneth on the bed and rested her head on his shoulder. Usually, Kenneth would hold her lovingly and tease her playfully, but this time he simply remained still. Chisom looked up. "Are you okay?" she asked. Kenneth sighed deeply. "I am fine." Chisom frowned slightly. "You don't sound fine." Kenneth turned to the other side of the bed. "I said I'm okay. I just want to sleep." Chisom felt hurt by his tone, but she remained quiet. She turned slowly and faced the ceiling, wondering what was happening to the man she loved so much. The next morning, Kenneth behaved normally again, making Chisom believe she had overthought the situation. But the same thing kept happening repeatedly. Some days he was caring and cheerful, other days he was distant and distracted. Sometimes Chisom would be talking to him and he would not even hear what she said. "Kenneth," she called one afternoon while they were eating lunch together. Kenneth did not respond. "Kenneth," she repeated louder. He looked up suddenly. "What?" Chisom laughed awkwardly. "I've been talking to you." Kenneth shook his head. "Sorry, my mind was somewhere else." Chisom smiled weakly. "You really need rest." Kenneth nodded quietly. "Maybe." As Kenneth's behavior slowly changed, Agnes also began to behave differently. At first, Chisom did not pay serious attention to it. Agnes had always liked looking good, but now she seemed to take extra care of her appearance. She started wearing tighter clothes around the house, clothes that looked too young and revealing for a woman of her age. One Saturday morning, Chisom came out of her room and saw Agnes wearing a short gown that stopped above her knees. Chisom paused in surprise. "Mama?" she said carefully. Agnes looked up from where she sat. "Yes." Chisom scratched her head lightly. "That dress is very short." Agnes laughed immediately. "So because I am old now, I should stop dressing well?" Chisom smiled awkwardly. "That's not what I mean, Mama. I'm just saying maybe something longer would look better." Agnes waved her hand dismissively. "Please leave me alone. I am still young and beautiful." Kenneth, who was sitting nearby, laughed softly. "Mama is right. She looks good." Agnes smiled proudly. "You see, Kenneth understands." Chisom forced a small smile, though something about the moment made her uncomfortable. Another evening, Chisom returned from work and met Agnes in another revealing outfit. This time, the gown exposed parts of her chest and shoulders. Chisom looked surprised. "Mama, why are you dressing like this inside the house?" Agnes rolled her eyes playfully. "My daughter, what is wrong with you? Must I dress like an old grandmother because I gave birth to you?" Chisom laughed nervously. "No, Mama, but you are still my mother." Agnes stood up and turned around jokingly. "And what is wrong with my body? Am I not still fresh?" Kenneth laughed loudly from where he sat. "Mama, you are funny." Agnes smiled proudly while Chisom remained quiet. Deep inside, she did not like it, but she did not want to seem disrespectful to her mother. She convinced herself that maybe she was overreacting. As weeks passed, Agnes continued dressing in ways that made Chisom uncomfortable. Sometimes she wore sleeveless tops and tight wrappers around the house. Other times she walked around without properly covering herself. Chisom tried to correct her gently. "Mama, please, Kenneth is around," she said one afternoon. Agnes laughed loudly. "Kenneth is my son too. Why are you behaving like this?" Kenneth immediately replied, "Exactly, she worries too much." Chisom looked from one face to another and smiled weakly. Okay, but inside her heart, something kept bothering her. Meanwhile, Kenneth continued becoming more distant toward her. He no longer complimented her like before. They no longer spent long hours talking together at night. Even when Chisom tried to create romantic moments, Kenneth often seemed distracted. One evening, Chisom cooked Kenneth's favorite meal and dressed beautifully to surprise him. When Kenneth arrived home, she smiled happily. "Welcome, baby." Kenneth looked at the food on the table. "What's all this?" Chisom smiled proudly. "I made your favorite." Kenneth nodded faintly. "Okay." Chisom waited for him to say more, maybe tell her she looked beautiful, but he simply sat down and started eating quietly. Chisom sat opposite him. "Do I look nice?" she asked playfully. Kenneth glanced at her briefly. "Yes, you look fine." Chisom forced a smile, but her heart sank. Before, Kenneth would not stop complimenting her whenever she dressed up. He would hold her hands and tell her how lucky he was to have her. But now, everything felt different. That night, Chisom sat beside Agnes in the kitchen. "Mama," she said softly. Agnes looked at her. "What is it?" Chisom sighed. "I feel like Kenneth is changing." Agnes frowned slightly. "Changing how?" Chisom looked down sadly. "He's no longer as close to me as before. Sometimes he barely talks to me." Agnes shook her head calmly. "Men are like that sometimes. Maybe he's stressed." Chisom nodded slowly. "That's what I keep telling myself." Agnes placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't overthink too much. Your husband still loves you." Chisom smiled faintly. "I hope so." Agnes hugged her gently. "Everything is fine." Chisom relaxed a little after hearing those words. She trusted her mother completely. She believed Agnes would never mislead her. Days turned into weeks and the warning signs became more visible, but Chisom refused to let suspicion enter her heart. She trusted Kenneth. She trusted Agnes. Even when she noticed them laughing together often, even when Kenneth defended Agnes more than usual, even when her heart whispered that something felt strange, she silenced those thoughts immediately. "Nothing bad can happen in my home," she kept telling herself. "My mother would never hurt me. My husband would never betray me." And because of that trust, Chisom ignored every warning sign standing right before her eyes. One Saturday morning, Chisom woke up feeling excited because she had not seen her close friend Sarah for many months. Before Chisom got married and moved to Abuja, Sarah had always been by her side. They shared secrets together, laughed together, and supported each other during difficult times. Even after marriage, they still spoke on the phone often, but because of busy schedules, they had not met physically for a very long time. That morning, as Chisom arranged the sitting room, she smiled happily and picked up her phone to call Sarah. "Sarah," she said excitedly as soon as the call connected. Sarah laughed loudly. "Look at you, married woman, you finally remembered me." Chisom laughed too. "Stop it, I have missed you." Sarah replied, "I have missed you too." Chisom sat down and said, "Please come and visit me today. I really want to see you." Sarah sounded happy immediately. "Of course, send me my address again." Chisom quickly sent the address and ended the call with a smile on her face. As she walked into the kitchen, she met Agnes preparing food. "Mama," Chisom said happily. Agnes turned. "Yes, my daughter." Chisom smiled brightly. "My friend Sarah is coming to visit today." Immediately, Agnes's face changed slightly. "Your friend?" she asked slowly. Chisom nodded. "Yes, we have not seen each other for a long time." Agnes kept stirring the pot quietly before speaking again. Married women should be careful with too many friends." Chisom frowned lightly. "What do you mean?" Agnes sighed. "I am just saying, some friends bring problems into marriages." Chisom laughed softly. "Not Sarah. She is a good person." Agnes shook her head slowly. "That is how it always starts. Today they are good. Tomorrow they begin to put ideas into your head." Chisom moved closer and held her mother's arm playfully. "Mama, Sarah is not like that. She has always supported me." Agnes looked at her seriously. "You are married now. Your focus should be your husband and your home." Chisom smiled gently. "And that is exactly what I am doing. Sarah is just visiting." Agnes looked away and muttered softly, I hope so. Chisom noticed the tension in her mother's voice but decided not to argue further. Mama, please don't worry too much. Agnes forced a small smile. Okay. Later that afternoon, Kenneth returned home earlier than usual. As soon as he entered, Chisom greeted him happily. Welcome, baby. Kenneth smiled faintly. Thank you. Chisom followed him into the sitting room. Guess what? Kenneth sat down. What? Chisom smiled excitedly. My friend Sarah is coming to visit today. Kenneth nodded calmly. Okay. Agnes, who was sitting nearby, suddenly spoke up. I already told her married women should avoid unnecessary friends. Kenneth looked at Agnes and then at Chisom. Why? Chisom quickly replied, Mama thinks friends destroy marriages. Kenneth laughed softly. Well, some actually do. Chisom rolled her eyes playfully. Not you two. Kenneth shrugged. I'm just saying. Chisom sat beside him. Sarah is not like that. She's very decent. Agnes folded her arms. We will see. The atmosphere suddenly became uncomfortable. Chisom forced herself to smile, but deep inside she felt uneasy. A few hours later, Sarah arrived. She looked beautiful and confident in a fitted gown that reached her knees. She carried a handbag and smiled brightly as Chisom opened the door. Sarah! Chisom screamed happily and hugged her tightly. Sarah laughed. Look at you, Abuja woman. Chisom smiled. Come inside. As Sarah entered the sitting room, she greeted politely. Good evening, Ma. Agnes looked at her from head to toe before replying coldly. Good evening. Sarah noticed the strange look immediately, but ignored it. Kenneth stood up and greeted her politely too. Welcome. Sarah smiled. Thank you. Chisom happily introduced everyone again, even though they had already heard about each other many times. Mama, this is the Sarah I always tell you. Agnes forced a smile. Chisom continued happily. Sarah, this is my husband Kenneth. Sarah smiled politely. Nice meeting you. Kenneth nodded. Same here. They all sat down together, but the tension in the room was obvious. Chisom tried hard to keep the conversation lively. Sarah, tell them about your new job. Sarah smiled and started talking about her work. Kenneth listened calmly and occasionally asked questions, but Agnes remained mostly silent, watching Sarah carefully. At one point, Sarah laughed at something Kenneth said. Agnes immediately frowned slightly. Chisom noticed, but ignored it. After some time, Chisom stood up. Let me bring drinks and snacks. Sarah smiled. Okay. As soon as Chisom disappeared into the kitchen, Agnes looked directly at Sarah with cold eyes. Sarah immediately sensed the change. Agnes spoke slowly. So, you are the famous friend. Sarah smiled politely. Yes, ma. Agnes looked her over again. Sarah remained calm. Kenneth, feeling uncomfortable, stood up. Let me help Chisom in the kitchen. The moment Kenneth left, Agnes leaned closer towards Sarah. Listen carefully, she said quietly. Sarah looked surprised. Ma? Agnes continued. My daughter is married now. She does not need people coming around to distract her. Sarah frowned slightly. I don't understand. Agnes folded her arms. Women like you bring confusion into homes. Sarah blinked in shock. Women like me? Agnes nodded firmly. Yes. Look at how you dress to come into another woman's home. Sarah looked down at her dress and then back at Agnes. What is wrong with my dress? Agnes scoffed. A married woman invited you here and you dressed like this? Or did you come to seduce her husband? Sarah's eyes widened immediately. Excuse me? Agnes continued coldly. You heard me. Sarah sat upright, now angry. Ma, with all due respect, that is very insulting. Agnes waved her hand dismissively. I know women like you. Sarah shook her head slowly in disbelief. No, ma, you don't know me. Agnes pointed at her dress. A decent woman does not dress half naked in another woman's house. Sarah laughed bitterly. Half naked? Agnes nodded. Yes. Sarah suddenly became bold. Then maybe you should look at yourself too. Agnes's face hardened immediately. "What did you say?" Sarah sat forward angrily. "I said maybe you should look at yourself too. You are a mother. Why do you wear short dresses around your daughter's husband?" Agnes stood up sharply. "How dare you?" Sarah also stood up. "No, how dare you accuse me of trying to seduce somebody's husband?" Agnes pointed at the door. "Leave this house." Sarah crossed her arms. "Gladly." Agnes moved closer angrily. "I warned my daughter about friends like you." Sarah laughed angrily. "And somebody should warn your daughter too." Agnes shouted. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah looked directly into her eyes. "You know exactly what I mean." At that moment, Chisom returned, carrying drinks, and immediately froze when she saw both women standing angrily. "What is happening?" she asked in confusion. Sarah grabbed her handbag angrily. "Ask your mother." Chisom looked from Sarah to Agnes. "Mama?" Agnes folded her arms. "Your friend insulted me." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Because she insulted me first." Chisom became confused. "Wait, what happened?" Agnes raised her voice dramatically. "I only advised her to respect your marriage and she started talking nonsense." Sarah shook her head angrily. "No, tell her the truth. Tell her how you accused me of trying to seduce somebody's husband." Chisom's eyes widened. "Mama said that?" Agnes scoffed. "Look at how she dresses." Sarah pointed angrily at Agnes. "And look at how you dress too." The room suddenly became silent. Chisom looked shocked. Kenneth slowly walked back into the sitting room after hearing the raised voices. "What is going on?" he asked. Sarah turned toward him angrily. "I am leaving." Chisom quickly held her arm. "Sarah, calm down." Sarah pulled away gently. "No, Chisom, I respect you too much to stay where I am insulted." Chisom looked helpless. "Please don't go like this." Sarah looked at her sadly. "Be careful, Chisom." Agnes shouted immediately. "What does that mean?" Sarah looked at Agnes one last time and said coldly, "You heard me." Then she stormed out angrily. Chisom quickly ran after her. "Sarah!" But Sarah entered her car and drove away without looking back. Chisom stood there in shock and confusion. When she returned inside slowly, the atmosphere in the house had completely changed. Agnes sat down angrily while Kenneth remained silent. Chisom looked at both of them, confused and disturbed, unable to understand why Sarah's visit had ended so badly. After Sarah's angry visit to the house, nothing remained the same again. Even though the matter looked like it had ended that day, the tension it created stayed quietly inside the home like smoke hidden inside a room. Chisom tried her best to act normal, but deep inside her heart, she remained disturbed by the strange arguments between her mother and her best friend. She could not understand why Agnes reacted so strongly towards Sarah, and she also could not forget the final warning Sarah gave her before driving away. "Be careful, Chisom." Those words kept echoing in her mind almost every night. Still, whenever she tried to think deeply about it, she quickly pushed the thought away because she trusted her mother completely. Maybe Sarah overreacted, she kept telling herself. Mama can be strict sometimes. One evening, after dinner, Chisom sat beside Agnes in the sitting room while Kenneth watched television quietly. "Mama," Chisom said softly, "I still don't understand what really happened between you and Sarah." Agnes immediately shook her head. "Forget that girl." Chisom frowned. "But she's my friend." Agnes scoffed lightly. "A friend that talks to your mother with respect?" Chisom sighed. "I know she was rude, but Sarah is not a bad person." Agnes folded her arms. "That girl does not have good intentions." Kenneth suddenly spoke from where he sat. "Honestly, I did not like the way she behaved either." Chisom looked at him. "You too?" Kenneth nodded calmly. "Yes, she was too aggressive." Chisom became quiet. Hearing both her husband and mother say the same thing made her feel confused. Agnes leaned closer and held her hand gently. "My daughter, not everybody that smiles with you loves you." Chisom nodded slowly. "Maybe." Agnes smiled faintly. "Just focus on your marriage and your peace." Chisom forced a smile. "Okay, Mama." But even after that conversation, something still felt strange inside her. Meanwhile, behind Chisom's back, the closeness between Kenneth and Agnes continued growing in ways that slowly crossed boundaries. At first, it remained hidden under harmless conversations and shared laughter, but gradually their relationship became more personal and more dangerous. Kenneth now spent more time at home whenever he had the opportunity. Sometimes he deliberately left work early, knowing Chisom would still be at her fashion shop. The moment he arrived home, Agnes welcomed him warmly. "Welcome, my son," she would say with a smile. Kenneth would smile back, "Thank you, Mama." One afternoon, Kenneth entered the kitchen while Agnes cooked. "Something smells nice," he said jokingly. Agnes laughed softly. "You always like food." Kenneth leaned against the wall and smiled, "Especially when you cook." Agnes looked at him and laughed again. "Flatterer." Kenneth shook his head. "I am serious." Agnes smiled proudly and continued cooking while Kenneth remained there watching her and talking. Their conversations became deeper and more personal. They talked about loneliness, relationships, disappointment, and desires. Agnes often complained about how lonely life became after her husband died. "You cannot understand," she said one afternoon. "Sleeping alone for years changes a person." Kenneth looked at her quietly. "I can imagine." Agnes sighed. "Sometimes I just miss having somebody close." Kenneth remained silent for a moment before speaking softly. "Everybody wants companionship." Agnes looked at him carefully. "Exactly." Their eyes met briefly before Agnes quickly looked away. At that moment, something dangerous quietly grew between them. Days passed and they became even more comfortable around each other. Agnes now laughed more freely when Kenneth was around. Kenneth also started paying more attention to her appearance. "Mama, this color looks good on you," he said one evening when Agnes wore a fitted gown. Agnes smiled proudly. "Really?" Kenneth nodded. "Yes, you don't even look your age." Agnes laughed happily. "You are trying to make me feel young again." Kenneth smiled slowly. "Maybe you are already." Agnes laughed again, but this time her laughter sounded softer and more personal. Unknown to Chisom, moments like that were becoming very common inside the house when she was away. One afternoon, Chisom called Kenneth from work. "Baby, I may close late today," she said. Kenneth replied calmly, "No problem." Chisom smiled. "Did you eat?" Kenneth looked toward the kitchen where Agnes stood preparing food. "Yes, Mama made food already." Chisom smiled happily. "Good. Please, both of you should eat." Kenneth replied softly, "We will." After the call ended, Agnes came out carrying a tray of food. "Your wife really trusts us," she said quietly. Kenneth looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Agnes sat down beside him. "She believes everything is perfect." Kenneth sighed softly. "Chisom has a good heart." Agnes nodded slowly. "Too good." There was silence between them for a few seconds before Kenneth finally said quietly, "Sometimes I feel guilty." Agnes looked at him carefully. "Then stop." Kenneth looked at her immediately. Agnes added softly, "If you truly want to stop." Kenneth remained silent. Agnes looked away and whispered, "Because I don't know if I want to stop anymore." Kenneth stared at her quietly and the atmosphere suddenly changed completely. From that day, their relationship crossed the line emotionally. The respect and boundaries that once existed slowly disappeared. They started hiding little things from Chisom. Sometimes, Kenneth deleted messages quickly whenever Chisom came close. Sometimes, Agnes became nervous whenever Chisom entered the room unexpectedly. One evening, Chisom walked into the sitting room and suddenly both Kenneth and Agnes stopped talking immediately. Chisom looked strangely. "Why are both of you quiet?" Agnes forced a laugh. "Nothing." Kenneth quickly picked up the remote control. "We were just talking about television." Chisom smiled weakly and sat down, but she noticed the strange tension immediately. Another day, Chisom returned home earlier than expected and met Agnes and Kenneth standing very close inside the kitchen. The moment they saw her, they quickly stepped apart. Chisom frowned slightly. "What happened?" Kenneth cleared his throat awkwardly. "Nothing. Mama almost slipped." Agnes nodded quickly. Yes, I almost fell." Chisom rushed forward. "Are you okay?" Agnes smiled nervously. "I am fine." Chisom looked at both of them suspiciously for a brief second, but again she ignored the feeling. "Maybe I am overthinking," she told herself silently. Yet the atmosphere in the house had changed completely. The warmth and peace that once filled their home slowly disappeared. Now there was silence, tension, and hidden emotions everywhere. Kenneth no longer spent much time talking to Chisom. Even when they sat together at night, his attention seemed elsewhere. Sometimes Chisom tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away. "I am tired," he would say. Chisom felt lonely inside her own marriage, but she still blamed work stress. One night, she sat beside him on the bed and said softly, "Kenneth, are we okay?" Kenneth looked at her briefly. "Why are you asking?" Chisom looked down sadly. "You feel far away from me these days." Kenneth sighed deeply. "I already told you work is stressing me." Chisom nodded slowly. "Okay." Kenneth turned away and closed his eyes. Chisom lay down quietly, staring at the ceiling with tears gathering in her eyes. In another part of the house, Agnes sat alone in her room thinking deeply too. Sometimes guilt touched her heart, but instead of stopping, her feelings for Kenneth kept growing stronger. She started dressing more carefully around him. She sprayed perfume often and paid extra attention to her appearance. Whenever Kenneth complimented her, she felt happy inside. One afternoon, while Chisom was at work, Agnes sat beside Kenneth in the sitting room. "Do you think I am a bad person?" she asked softly. Kenneth looked at her quietly. "Why are you asking?" Agnes sighed sadly. "Because sometimes I feel ashamed of myself." Kenneth remained silent. Agnes continued, "But whenever I try to stay away from you, I can't." Kenneth looked into her eyes. "You are not the only one." Agnes swallowed hard. "This thing is wrong." Kenneth nodded slowly. "I know." Agnes looked away sadly. "Then why does it feel impossible to stop?" Kenneth had no answer. The silence between them spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, Chisom continued sensing that something was wrong inside her home, but her heart refused to believe the truth standing right before her eyes. She trusted her mother too much to suspect her, and she loved Kenneth too deeply to imagine betrayal. Every strange moment, every suspicious behavior, every uncomfortable silence she explained away with excuses. But little by little, her once peaceful home was slowly becoming a place filled with hidden secrets and silent tension. 2 weeks passed after the strained tension that followed Sarah's visit. But instead of things getting better, the atmosphere inside the house became heavier every single day. Chisom tried everything possible to bring peace back into her marriage. She tried talking more with Kenneth, cooking his favorite meals, dressing beautifully for him, and even closing early from work sometimes so they could spend more time together. But nothing seemed to change. Kenneth remained emotionally distant, while Agnes continued acting strangely calm, almost too calm, as if nothing was wrong. Every day, Chisom woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest that she could not explain. Sometimes she sat alone in her fashion shop and stared into space, thinking deeply. Her mind kept replaying Sarah's warning. "Be careful, Chisom." Those words refused to leave her head. One afternoon, while arranging clothes for a customer, her phone suddenly rang. She checked the screen and saw Sarah's name. Chisom hesitated for a moment before answering because, since the argument at the house, their friendship had become awkward. Finally, she picked up. "Hello, Sarah," she said softly. Sarah's voice sounded serious immediately. "Where are you?" Chisom frowned. "I'm at my shop. Why?" Sarah lowered her voice. "I need to see something with your own eyes." Chisom's heart began to beat faster. "Sarah, you are scaring me. What is going on?" Sarah sighed deeply. "I cannot explain everything on the phone. Just come, please." Chisom stood up immediately. "Okay, send me the address." Sarah quickly sent the location and ended the call. Chisom stared at the phone for a few seconds, confused and nervous. Something about Sarah's voice frightened her deeply. She quickly told her assistant, "Please take care of the shop for me. I need to go somewhere urgently." The young lady nodded. "Okay, ma." Chisom grabbed her handbag and hurried out. As she drove toward the location Sarah sent, her mind raced with different thoughts. What could be so urgent? She kept asking herself. Did something happen? She tried calling Kenneth, but his line was busy. She frowned slightly. Maybe he is in a meeting. When she finally arrived at the location, she realized it was close to a big hotel. She parked her car and immediately saw Sarah standing near the roadside looking nervous. Chisom rushed toward her. "Sarah, what is going on?" Sarah looked around carefully before speaking. "Calm down first." Chisom became impatient. "How can I calm down when you called me like this?" Sarah grabbed her hand gently. "Please, trust me." Chisom looked confused. Trust you for what? Sarah sighed deeply. I need you to see something with your own eyes. Chisom's heart beat immediately. What are you talking about? Sarah looked at her seriously. Just watch. Chisom's hands began shaking slightly. The atmosphere around her suddenly felt strange. Cars moved in and out of the hotel compound. People walked past casually, unaware that somebody's entire life was about to change forever. Minutes felt like hours as they waited silently behind a parked vehicle. Chisom looked restless. Sarah, please tell me what is happening. Sarah held her arm gently. Please, just wait. Then suddenly, Sarah whispered, Look. Chisom slowly lifted her eyes toward the hotel entrance. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. Then her body froze completely. Kenneth walked out of the hotel entrance slowly, dressed casually and smiling. Beside him was Agnes, her mother. Chisom blinked repeatedly, hoping her eyes were lying to her. No, she whispered softly. No. Her legs became weak immediately. She held the side of the car for support. Kenneth and Agnes looked relaxed and comfortable together, far too comfortable for a son-in-law and mother-in-law. Agnes laughed softly at something Kenneth said, and Kenneth touched her arm gently as they walked. Chisom's breathing became uneven. No, she repeated again. Tears instantly gathered in her eyes. Sarah looked at her sadly. I'm sorry. But Chisom barely had her. Her entire attention was fixed on the shocking sight before her. Kenneth and Agnes stopped near the entrance, still talking softly. Then Chisom heard Kenneth's voice clearly. I don't even feel peace when I'm away from you. Agnes smiled shyly. Kenneth, stop. Kenneth shook his head gently. I'm serious. I love being with you. Agnes looked around nervously. What if somebody sees us? Kenneth smiled calmly. Nobody will. Then he leaned closer and said softly, Honestly, sometimes I feel happier with you than I ever felt with Chisom. The moment Chisom heard those words, something inside her broke completely. Her heart shattered into pieces instantly. Tears rolled down her cheeks uncontrollably. She covered her mouth quickly to stop herself from crying out loudly. Jesus, she whispered painfully. Jesus! Sarah quickly held her shoulders because her body almost collapsed. Chisom calmed down, but Chisom could barely breathe. Her chest felt tight. Her ears rang loudly. The two people she trusted most in the world stood right before her, betraying her openly. Her husband, her own mother. The pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Agnes suddenly touched Kenneth's face gently and smiled. You shouldn't say things like that. Kenneth held her hand softly. Why? It's the truth. Chisom's tears increased immediately. Oh my God, she cried quietly. Oh my God. Sarah held her tightly. Please, don't make noise. But Chisom could not stop trembling. Her entire body shook violently from shock and heartbreak. All the strange moments she ignored suddenly came back into her mind. Kenneth's distance, Agnes's behavior, Sarah's warning, their secret conversations, the silence whenever she entered a room. Everything suddenly made sense. The truth stood before her now, impossible to deny. The betrayal was real, very real. Kenneth opened the car door for Agnes carefully. Agnes smiled warmly at him before entering the car. Kenneth walked around and entered the driver's seat. Before driving off, he leaned closer and kissed Agnes gently on the cheek. The moment Chisom saw that, she broke down completely. Tears poured from her eyes as she covered her face with both hands. My own mother, she cried painfully. My own mother. Sarah hugged her tightly. I'm sorry, Chisom. I'm so sorry. Chisom shook her head repeatedly, like somebody losing her mind. No, this cannot be happening. Sarah's own eyes became emotional. I wanted to tell you before, but I knew you wouldn't believe me. Chisom stared blankly at the car as Kenneth drove Agnes out of the hotel compound like lovers returning from a secret meeting. Her world shattered completely in that moment. Everything she believed about love, trust, marriage and family collapsed before her eyes. The betrayal was undeniable. It was no longer suspicion. It was no longer fear. It was the painful truth standing naked before her. And as the car disappeared from sight, Chisom stood there, trembling with tears, feeling like her entire life had just ended. Chisom stood beside Sarah's car for several minutes after Kenneth and Agnes drove away from the hotel. Her body felt weak and heavy, like all the strength inside her had suddenly disappeared. Tears continued rolling down her cheeks non-stop. Her hands were shaking badly, and her chest felt tight with pain. She could not believe what she had just seen with her own eyes. Everything still felt like a terrible nightmare. "My own husband," she whispered painfully. "My own mother." Sarah stood beside her quietly, feeling sorry for her. "Chisom," Sarah said softly, "please calm down." But Chisom shook her head slowly. "How do I calm down after this?" she cried. "How?" Her voice broke completely as fresh tears filled her eyes again. Sarah held her shoulders gently. "I know this is painful." Chisom laughed bitterly through her tears. "Painful? Sarah, they destroyed me." Sarah looked down sadly because she did not know what else to say. Chisom suddenly wiped her tears angrily and picked up her handbag. "I'm going home." Sarah quickly held her arm. "Please don't do anything dangerous." Chisom's eyes burned with anger. "Dangerous? They already destroyed everything." Sarah sighed deeply. "At least calm down before confronting them." But Chisom was no longer listening. Her entire body was filled with anger, heartbreak, confusion, and betrayal. She entered her car quickly and drove off. Throughout the drive home, tears kept blurring her vision. She held the steering wheel tightly, while painful memories kept flashing through her mind. The day she introduced Kenneth to her mother, the day Agnes moved into their home, the laughter they shared together, the trust she gave them freely. Everything now looked fake and dirty in her eyes. "How long has this been happening?" she whispered painfully. "How could they do this to me?" By the time she reached the house, her face was swollen from crying. She packed roughly and rushed toward the entrance angrily. Her heart was beating fast with rage. The moment she entered the sitting room, she saw Agnes sitting comfortably on the couch watching television as if nothing had happened. For a few seconds, Chisom simply stood there staring at her mother in disbelief. Agnes looked up and smiled casually. "You are back early today." The moment Chisom heard that calm voice, something exploded inside her. "Stop pretending!" she screamed loudly. Agnes jumped in shock immediately. "Chisom?" Chisom pointed at her with trembling hands. "Stop pretending!" Agnes stood up quickly, confused. "What is wrong?" Chisom laughed bitterly through tears. "What is wrong?" Her voice shook violently. "You are asking me what is wrong?" Agnes stared at her nervously. "My daughter. Don't call me your daughter," Chisom shouted painfully. Agnes froze completely. Chisom's entire body trembled with anger and heartbreak. "You are evil," she cried. "You are wicked." Agnes looked frightened now. "Chisom, calm down first." Chisom laughed painfully again. "Calm down? After seeing you at the hotel with my husband?" Agnes's face changed immediately. Silence filled the room instantly. Chisom stared directly into her eyes. "Yes, I saw both of you." Agnes slowly sat down weakly, like her legs suddenly lost strength. Chisom continued crying angrily. "I saw everything. Everything." Agnes opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Chisom pointed at her. "You betrayed me, my own mother." Agnes finally whispered softly, "Chisom." But Chisom screamed again. "Why?" Tears rolled heavily down her face. "Why would you do this to me?" Agnes covered her face with trembling hands. "I'm sorry." Chisom laughed bitterly. "Sorry?" She moved closer angrily. "You slept with my husband." Agnes started crying immediately. It was not intentional. Chisom stared at her in disbelief. "Not intentional?" Agnes nodded weakly through tears. "I swear I never planned it." Chisom shook her head repeatedly. "You expect me to believe that?" Agnes cried harder. "I don't know how it happened." Chisom's voice broke painfully. "You don't know how it happened?" Agnes wiped her tears quickly. "We became close, little by little." Chisom stared at her mother like a stranger. "You are my mother." Agnes cried softly. "I know." Chisom pointed angrily. "You came into my home. I trusted you. Agnes lowered her head in shame. I know. Chisom shouted again. Then why? Before Agnes could answer, the front door suddenly opened. Kenneth entered the house carrying his bag casually. The moment he saw Chisom's face and Agnes crying, he stopped immediately. What happened? He asked slowly. Chisom turned toward him with burning eyes. You should tell me what happened. Kenneth became tense immediately. Chisom walked toward him angrily. You disgusting man. Kenneth swallowed hard. Chisom, don't say my name, she shouted. Kenneth looked at Agnes nervously. Agnes avoided his eyes completely. Chisom laughed bitterly. Yes, I know everything. Kenneth remained silent. Chisom moved closer and pushed his chest angrily. How could you sleep with my mother? Kenneth closed his eyes briefly. Please, calm down. Chisom screamed loudly. Don't tell me to calm down. Kenneth sighed deeply. I didn't want you to find out this way. Chisom stared at him in disbelief. Find out? She laughed painfully. So you planned to continue? Kenneth rubbed his forehead tiredly. Things became complicated. Chisom shook her head slowly. You are shameless. Agnes cried softly from the couch. Kenneth looked at Chisom carefully. Listen to me first. Chisom pointed angrily. No, you will listen to me. Tears rolled down her cheeks again. I loved you. I trusted you. I defended you. Kenneth sighed deeply. Chisom, you have not been there for me. Chisom froze. What? Kenneth looked at her directly now. You became too busy with work. Chisom stared at him in shock. Are you serious right now? Kenneth continued calmly. You were always at your shop, always busy. Chisom laughed bitterly through tears. So because I worked hard for our future, you decided to sleep with my mother? Kenneth remained silent. Chisom shook her head painfully. You are disgusting. Kenneth sighed again. I'm not saying I was right. Chisom pointed at Agnes. And you? Agnes cried softly. I made a mistake. Chisom shouted angrily. A mistake? She laughed bitterly again. This is not a mistake. This is evil. Agnes covered her face and cried harder. I swear I never wanted this. Chisom looked at her with deep disappointment. You destroyed me. Agnes whispered through tears. Forgive me. Chisom shook her head slowly. I can never forgive this. Silence filled the room for a few seconds except for Agnes crying. Then suddenly, Agnes looked up weakly and said softly, There's something else. Chisom frowned angrily. What else? Agnes hesitated. Kenneth looked nervous immediately. Agnes swallowed hard before speaking quietly. I'm pregnant. The room became completely silent. Chisom blinked slowly, unable to process the words she just heard. What? She whispered faintly. Agnes lowered her head in shame. I'm pregnant for Kenneth. The moment those words entered Chisom's ears, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath her feet. Her body became weak instantly. She staggered backwards slowly until she collapsed onto the chair behind her. No, she whispered painfully. No. Tears poured heavily from her eyes again. Kenneth remained silent while Agnes cried softly. Chisom held her chest tightly as if struggling to breathe. Jesus, she whispered painfully. Jesus. Her entire world shattered completely at that moment. Everything was gone. Her marriage, her trust, her peace, her family. Her own mother was carrying her husband's child. The pain was too much for her heart to carry. She stared at both of them with deep heartbreak and disbelief. The two people she loved most in this world had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And in that painful moment, Chisom felt completely broken inside. The room remained silent after Agnes confessed that she was pregnant with Kenneth. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sound that could be heard was Agnes's quiet crying and Chisom's heavy breathing. Chisom sat frozen on the chair, staring blankly at both of them like she no longer recognized the people standing before her. Her mind could not even process the level of betrayal she had just heard. Her own husband had gotten her own mother pregnant. The pain was too deep, too heavy, too shocking. Chisom slowly looked at Kenneth with tears rolling endlessly down her face. "You got my mother pregnant," she whispered weakly. Kenneth lowered his head in shame and said nothing. Chisom turned slowly toward Agnes. "And you carried my husband's child." Agnes cried harder immediately. "Chisom, please forgive me." Chisom suddenly turned and began walking toward the bedroom. Kenneth quickly followed her. "Where are you going?" Chisom did not answer. She entered the room angrily and pulled out a traveling bag from under the bed. Kenneth froze immediately. "Chisom." Chisom opened the wardrobe and began throwing clothes inside the bag angrily. Kenneth rushed closer. "What are you doing?" Chisom continued packing without looking at him. "I'm leaving." Kenneth's eyes widened. "Please don't do this." Chisom laughed bitterly. "Do what? Leave the house where my husband sleeps with my mother?" Kenneth sighed deeply. "Please, let's handle this carefully." Chisom turned toward him with burning eyes. "There is nothing left to handle." Kenneth stepped closer carefully. "I know I made a terrible mistake." Chisom interrupted him immediately. "A terrible mistake is forgetting an anniversary. Sleeping with your wife's mother is evil." Kenneth lowered his head. "I'm sorry." Chisom shook her head repeatedly while tears fell from her eyes. "Your sorry means nothing to me anymore." Kenneth tried reaching for her hand, but she pulled away immediately. "Don't touch me." Kenneth looked heartbroken now. "Please, Chisom, we can still fix this." Chisom stared at him in complete disbelief. "Fix this?" She laughed painfully again. "How exactly do you fix this?" Kenneth remained silent. Chisom pointed toward the sitting room angrily. "My mother is carrying your child." Kenneth closed his eyes briefly. Chisom continued packing her clothes aggressively. Kenneth watched helplessly. "Please don't leave tonight." Chisom ignored him completely. Kenneth sighed deeply again. "At least wait until morning." Chisom suddenly stopped packing and looked directly into his eyes. "If I stay in this house another minute, I will lose my mind." Kenneth swallowed hard. Chisom continued with tears rolling down her cheeks. "Everywhere I look reminds me of your betrayal." She pointed around the room painfully. "This bed, this room, this house." Kenneth whispered softly, "I still love you." Chisom froze for a second before laughing bitterly. "Love?" She shook her head slowly. "You don't know the meaning of love." Kenneth looked hurt. "I mean it." Chisom stared at him coldly. "A man who loves his wife does not sleep with her mother." Kenneth had no response. Chisom zipped her bag angrily and picked it up. Kenneth stood in front of the door immediately. "Please don't go." Chisom's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Move." Kenneth shook his head slowly. "Not like this." Chisom looked exhausted emotionally. "Kenneth, move away from that door." Kenneth sighed deeply. "I know I hurt you." Chisom interrupted him sharply. "Hurt me? You destroyed me." Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Kenneth finally stepped aside slowly. Chisom carried her bag and walked toward the sitting room. Agnes immediately stood up when she saw the bag. "Chisom, where are you going?" Chisom looked at her coldly. "Away from this disgusting place." Agnes cried harder. "Please don't leave." Chisom shook her head. "I cannot breathe in this house anymore." Agnes rushed toward her. "My daughter, please." Chisom stepped back immediately. "Don't call me your daughter." Agnes held her chest painfully and cried loudly. "Please forgive me." Chisom stared at her with deep disappointment. "You destroyed the only family I had left." Agnes sobbed helplessly. "I never wanted this." Chisom shook her head slowly. "But you still did it." Kenneth followed behind quietly. "At least let me drive you." Chisom laughed bitterly. "Drive me? After everything?" Kenneth looked helpless. "I'm just worried about you." Chisom wiped her tears angrily. "You should have worried before sleeping with my mother." Kenneth lowered his eyes in shame again. Chisom picked up her handbag and moved toward the door. Agnes suddenly fell to her knees crying loudly. "Please don't leave me like this." Chisom paused briefly but did not turn back. Tears rolled down her face again. "You left me first," she whispered painfully. Then she opened the door and walked out. Kenneth quickly followed her outside. "Chisom!" he called desperately, but Chisom ignored him and headed toward her car. Kenneth stood beside the car helplessly. "At least answer my calls." Chisom looked at him one final time with deep heartbreak. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Then she entered her car and drove away. Kenneth stood there watching helplessly as her car disappeared into the night. Inside the car, Chisom cried uncontrollably while driving. Her vision became blurry from tears, but she kept moving forward. She had no destination in mind at first. She only knew one thing clearly. She could not stay in that house anymore. The pain was too much. Her heart felt completely shattered. After driving around for some time, she finally stopped at a quiet hotel. The receptionist noticed her swollen face immediately. "Good evening, ma," the young woman said politely. Chisom forced herself to speak calmly. "I need a room." The receptionist nodded quickly and processed everything quietly. A few minutes later, Chisom entered the hotel room alone, carrying her bag. The moment the door closed behind her, she dropped the bag on the floor and broke down completely. She cried loudly into her hands until her body became weak from exhaustion. All the memories of her marriage kept flashing through her mind painfully. The love, the trust, the laughter, everything was gone now, destroyed by betrayal. Chisom slowly sat on the edge of the bed with tears still falling from her eyes. Deep inside her heart, she knew the painful truth already. Her marriage was over, and even though the future suddenly looked lonely and uncertain, she also knew she could never return to a home filled with betrayal. That night, alone inside the quiet hotel room, Chisom made the most painful but strongest decision of her life. She chose peace over pain, even if it meant starting her life all over again. The first few days Chisom spent at the hotel were some of the darkest days of her life. Every morning she woke up with heavy pain in her chest, and every night she cried herself to sleep. The beautiful marriage she once believed in had collapsed completely. The two people she trusted most had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Sometimes she sat quietly on the hotel bed for hours staring at nothing. Other times she cried until her eyes became swollen and red. She barely ate well, she barely slept peacefully. Her mind was constantly filled with painful memories. She remembered how Kenneth used to hold her hands lovingly. She remembered how Agnes smiled at her every morning like a caring mother. Now, all those memories felt fake and dirty to her. One afternoon, Chisom sat on the bed holding her phone while staring at Kenneth's missed calls. He had called her many times since she left the house. He also sent several messages apologizing and begging her to come back home. But Chisom ignored every single one of them. She could not even bear hearing his voice anymore. Agnes also tried calling several times, but Chisom refused to answer. Each time the phone rang and she saw their names, fresh pain entered her heart again. "Why did they do this to me?" she whispered quietly one evening before breaking into tears again. A few days later, her friend Sarah came to visit her at the hotel after Chisom finally agreed to see her. The moment Sarah entered the room and saw Chisom's condition, her heart broke immediately. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered sadly as she hugged her tightly. Chisom broke down crying again. "Sarah, my life is finished," she cried painfully. Sarah held her gently. "No, don't say that." Chisom shook her head while crying. "Everything is destroyed." Sarah sat beside her and held her hands tightly. "Listen to me. What they did was terrible, but your life is not over." Chisom looked weak and exhausted emotionally. "How do I move on from this?" Sarah sighed deeply. "One step at a time." Chisom looked down sadly. "I trusted them so much." Sarah nodded softly. I know. Chisom wiped her tears slowly. Sometimes I feel like I cannot breathe. Sarah held her shoulder gently. You are stronger than this pain. Chisom smiled faintly through tears. I don't feel strong. Sarah remained with her for hours that day, encouraging her and trying to make her feel better. Before leaving, Sarah looked at her seriously. Please don't lock yourself inside this room forever. Chisom sighed weakly. I just don't want to see anybody. Sarah shook her head gently. Isolation will only make the pain worse. Chisom remained silent. Sarah added softly, try to come downstairs sometimes. Sit outside. Breathe fresh air. Chisom nodded slowly. I will try. After Sarah left, Chisom remained thoughtful for a long time. Deep inside, she knew Sarah was right. Staying locked inside the room all day was making her sadness even heavier. The following evening, after spending most of the day crying again, Chisom finally decided to leave the room for the first time properly. She washed her face slowly and changed into a simple gown. Although her eyes were still swollen from crying, she tried to compose herself. She walked quietly downstairs to the hotel restaurant area. The atmosphere there was calm and peaceful. Soft music played quietly in the background while a few people sat eating or talking softly. Chisom found a quiet corner table and sat down alone. A waiter approached politely. Good evening, ma. What would you like? Chisom forced a small smile. Just a chilled drink. The waiter nodded politely and left. Chisom sat quietly staring into space again. Her mind was still heavy with pain. She watched people around her laughing and talking normally, while her own life felt completely broken. How did everything become like this? She thought sadly. A few minutes later, the waiter brought her drink. Thank you, she said softly. After taking a few sips, she suddenly noticed someone standing beside her table. She looked up slowly and saw a tall, handsome man dressed neatly in simple clothes. He looked calm and gentle. The man smiled politely. Good evening, he said respectfully. Chisom looked slightly surprised. Good evening. The man pointed politely toward the empty seat opposite her. Do you mind if I sit? Chisom hesitated briefly before nodding slowly. Okay. The man sat carefully. Thank you. For a few seconds, there was silence between them. Then the man smiled gently. My name is Chinedu. Chisom nodded faintly. I'm Chisom. Chinedu smiled warmly. Nice to meet you. Chisom gave a weak smile. Nice to meet you too. Chinedu looked at her carefully for a moment before speaking again. I hope you don't think I'm disturbing you. Chisom shook her head lightly. No. Chinedu nodded slowly. Honestly, I noticed you looked very sad sitting here alone. Chisom quickly looked away. I'm fine. Chinedu smiled gently. Most people who say they are fine while looking that sad are usually not fine. Chisom remained quiet. Chinedu continued calmly. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. Chisom sighed softly. It's nothing. Chinedu leaned back slightly. Life can be very unfair sometimes. Chisom looked at him briefly. Something about his calm voice felt comforting. Chinedu smiled gently again. I've seen pain too. Maybe not your own kind of pain, but enough to know when somebody is hurting deeply. Chisom swallowed hard and looked down at her drink quietly. Chinedu continued softly. Sometimes talking helps. Chisom laughed weakly without happiness. Talking cannot change anything. Chinedu nodded slowly. True, but carrying pain alone can destroy a person. Chisom became silent again. She did not know why, but for the first time in days, somebody's words were calming her instead of increasing her anger. Chinedu noticed her hesitation and smiled gently. Relax, I'm not trying to force you. Chisom finally spoke softly. My life just became complicated. Chinedu nodded. I can see that. Chisom stared at her drink for a few seconds before whispering painfully. The people I trusted most betrayed me. Chinedu's expression softened immediately. I'm sorry. Chisom shook her head slowly. I still cannot believe it. Chinedu remained quiet, allowing her speak at her own pace. After several moments of silence, Chisom finally began telling him everything slowly. At first, she spoke carefully, but little by little, the words started flowing naturally. She told him about her marriage to Kenneth. She told him how happy they once were. She told him about bringing her mother Agnes into their home because she felt lonely. Then slowly, she explained how everything changed. Chinedu listened quietly without interrupting her. He did not judge her. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply listened carefully. When Chisom finally reached the part where she caught Kenneth and Agnes at the hotel, tears filled her eyes again. "I saw them with my own eyes," she whispered painfully. "My husband and my mother." Chinedu shook his head slowly in disbelief. "That is terrible." Chisom wiped her tears weakly. "And now she is pregnant for him." Chinedu remained silent for a few seconds before speaking softly. "I cannot even imagine how painful that must be." Chisom laughed bitterly. "Sometimes I feel like my heart stopped working that day." Chinedu looked at her kindly. "You are still breathing. That means your story is not over." Chisom looked at him quietly. Chinedu smiled gently. "What happened to you was terrible, but it is not the end of your life." Chisom sighed softly. "It feels like the end." Chinedu shook his head slowly. "No, pain can make us feel trapped, but healing comes slowly." Chisom stared at him thoughtfully. "How do you talk so calmly?" Chinedu smiled faintly. "Because anger destroys peace." Chisom nodded slowly. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Chinedu looked directly into her eyes. "You are still Chisom, a strong woman who survived betrayal." Chisom remained silent, but deep inside, his words touched her heart. They continued talking for a long time that evening. Chinedu told her a little about himself too. He explained that he worked as a consultant for a construction company and often stayed at the hotel whenever he had projects in Abuja. He spoke calmly, respectfully, and with maturity. There was something peaceful about him that made Chisom feel comfortable. For the first time in many days, she found herself smiling slightly during a conversation. When it became late, Chinedu looked at the time and stood up slowly. "I should let you rest." Chisom nodded softly. "Thank you." Chinedu smiled gently. "For what?" Chisom looked at him sincerely. "For listening." Chinedu nodded. "Anytime." Then he hesitated briefly before asking politely, "Can I check on you sometimes?" Chisom looked at him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Okay." Chinedu smiled warmly. "Good." They exchanged phone numbers before leaving the restaurant area together. As Chisom walked back toward her room that night, something inside her felt slightly lighter. The pain was still there. The betrayal still hurt deeply. But for the first time since her world collapsed, she no longer felt completely alone. Little by little, Chinedu's calm presence and kind words began bringing comfort into her broken heart. And slowly, without forcing it, a new friendship started growing naturally during the darkest season of her life. After Chisom left the house, the atmosphere inside the building changed completely. The peace, laughter, and warmth that once filled a house disappeared overnight. The silence inside the building felt heavy and uncomfortable. Even the walls seemed to carry shame and regret. Kenneth and Agnes were now left alone together, but instead of happiness, confusion and tension slowly took over their lives. The relationship they once thought would bring them comfort suddenly began showing its ugly side. The excitement and secret passion that brought them together started fading little by little, and reality slowly entered their lives like a storm. The first few days after Chisom left were very awkward. Agnes stayed mostly inside her room, crying and blaming herself. Kenneth also looked stressed and exhausted. Sometimes he sat alone in the sitting room staring into space for hours. One evening, Agnes walked slowly into the sitting room and found Kenneth sitting quietly with a bottle of drink. "You have not eaten," she said softly. Kenneth shrugged without looking at her. "I'm not hungry." Agnes sat down beside him carefully. "You need to eat something." Kenneth sighed heavily. "I said I'm fine." Agnes became quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Do you think Chisom will ever forgive us?" Kenneth laughed bitterly. "Forgive us?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't think so." Agnes lowered her eyes sadly. "I miss her." Kenneth looked away silently. Agnes continued softly. "I destroyed my daughter's life." Kenneth rubbed his forehead tiredly. "We both did." Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Then Agnes looked at him carefully. "Do you regret everything?" Kenneth hesitated briefly before answering. "I regret hurting Chisom." Agnes looked hurt immediately. "Is that all?" Kenneth quickly added, "That's not what I mean." But Agnes already looked offended. "So you regret me?" Kenneth sighed deeply. "Agnes, please don't start." Agnes folded her arms slowly. "I'm just asking." Kenneth stood up tiredly. "I can't do this tonight." Then he walked away toward the bedroom, leaving Agnes sitting alone in silence. That night, Agnes cried quietly on the couch while holding her stomach gently. She suddenly began feeling afraid. The relationship that once felt exciting now felt uncertain and unstable. Days passed and things became even worse between them. Since Chisom left, Kenneth stopped behaving lovingly toward Agnes. He became colder and more distant. Sometimes he stayed out late after work. Other times he avoided conversations completely. Agnes noticed every change immediately, and it slowly made her insecure. One afternoon, Kenneth returned home very late. Agnes was sitting in the living room waiting for him angrily. The moment he entered, she stood up quickly. "Where have you been?" Kenneth looked exhausted. "Work?" Agnes frowned deeply. "Since morning?" Kenneth dropped his bag carelessly. "I had meetings." Agnes crossed her arms. "You didn't even answer my calls." Kenneth sighed heavily. "My phone was busy." Agnes stared at him suspiciously. "Busy doing what?" Kenneth looked irritated immediately. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Agnes moved closer. "I'm asking a simple question." Kenneth shook his head tiredly. "Agnes, please don't want problems tonight." Agnes shook her head angrily. "No, you will talk to me." Kenneth looked frustrated now. "Talk about what?" Agnes's eyes became emotional. "About us." Kenneth became silent immediately. Agnes continued softly. "Do you still love me?" Kenneth looked away. That silence alone broke Agnes's heart. "Answer me," she said weakly. Kenneth finally sighed deeply. "I don't know anymore." Agnes gasped painfully. "What?" Kenneth shook his head slowly. Everything happened too fast. Agnes stared at him in disbelief. "You told me you loved me." Kenneth closed his eyes briefly. "How can I love someone who is close to my mother's age?" At that moment, I thought I did. Agnes stepped back slowly like somebody slapped her. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "So now what?" Kenneth looked exhausted emotionally. "I don't know." Agnes pointed at her stomach angrily. "And what about this baby?" Kenneth remained silent again. Agnes burst into tears immediately. "You used me." Kenneth looked frustrated. "Please, stop acting like I forced you." Agnes froze. "Excuse me?" Kenneth's voice became louder. "We both made bad choices." Agnes cried angrily. "I ruined my daughter's life because of you." Kenneth laughed bitterly. "And I ruined my marriage because of you too." The room became silent immediately after those words. Agnes stared at him in complete shock. "So now you blame me?" Kenneth shook his head tiredly. "I'm saying we both made mistakes." Agnes wiped her tears angrily. "No, don't say we. You chased me." Kenneth looked offended immediately. "I chased you?" Agnes nodded angrily. "Yes, you were the one always telling me sweet things." Kenneth laughed bitterly again. "And you enjoyed every second of it. Agnes looked hurt deeply. You promised me love. Kenneth sighed loudly. Agnes, stop acting like this relationship was built on honesty. Those words hit Agnes painfully. Deep down, she knew he was right. Their relationship started with betrayal, secrecy, and lies. How could peace ever come from something like that? But still, hearing the truth from Kenneth's mouth broke her heart completely. As weeks passed, their arguments became more frequent. Small issues turned into big fights quickly. Agnes became more insecure and controlling because she feared Kenneth would abandon her completely. She constantly questioned him about where he went, who he spoke with, and why he spent less time at home. Kenneth grew more irritated every day. One evening, Agnes saw Kenneth smiling while typing on his phone. Immediately, her mood changed. Who are you chatting with? She asked sharply. Kenneth looked up calmly. Nobody. Agnes moved closer suspiciously. Let me see your phone. Kenneth frowned immediately. What? Agnes stretched out her hand. I said, let me see your phone. Kenneth stood up angrily. Are you serious right now? Agnes folded her arms. Why are you hiding it? Kenneth shook his head in frustration. This is exactly why I don't like staying here anymore. Agnes's eyes widened painfully. You don't like staying with me? Kenneth sighed deeply. Every day is problem after problem. Agnes pointed angrily. Because I'm carrying your child. Kenneth laughed bitterly. And whose fault is that? Agnes froze completely. Tears filled her eyes immediately. Kenneth looked exhausted. I'm tired of fighting. Agnes cried softly. Then stop making me feel insecure. Kenneth shook his head. You think controlling me will fix anything? Agnes moved closer desperately. I'm scared. Kenneth looked at her silently. Agnes continued weakly. You are already pulling away from me. Kenneth sighed. Because everything about this situation is wrong. Agnes's tears increased immediately. But you said you loved me. Kenneth looked away quietly. I thought I did. Those words wounded Agnes deeply again. Slowly, regret began taking over both of their lives. The relationship that once felt exciting now felt like punishment. Kenneth constantly thought about Chisom and the peaceful life he destroyed. Sometimes, he sat alone looking at old pictures of their happy moments together. He missed her kindness, her loyalty, and the peace she brought into his life. One evening, Kenneth sat quietly looking at a wedding photo on his phone. Agnes walked in and saw him staring at Chisum's picture. Her face changed immediately. You are looking at her again? Kenneth quickly locked the phone. It's nothing. Agnes shook her head angrily. You still love her. Kenneth remained silent. Agnes laughed bitterly through tears. So what am I now? Kenneth looked tired emotionally. Agnes, please. Agnes pointed angrily. You destroyed my relationship with my daughter, and now you regret choosing me. Kenneth finally snapped. Because none of this should have happened. Agnes gasped painfully, like the words stabbed her directly in the heart. Kenneth realized what he said and sighed deeply. I didn't mean it that way. Agnes shook her head slowly while crying. No, you meant it. Then she turned and walked away into her room. That night, Agnes cried alone for hours. She finally understood something painful. The relationship she sacrificed everything for was already falling apart. There was no trust between them, no peace, no happiness. Only regret, guilt, anger, and fear. Months passed after Chisom left the house, but Kenneth's life never returned to normal again. Every day felt heavy and uncomfortable. The home that once felt peaceful now felt empty and full of regret. Agnes's pregnancy continued growing, but instead of bringing joy, it only increased the tension between them. Their arguments became worse, and sometimes they stopped speaking to each other for days. Kenneth no longer rushed home after work. Sometimes he stayed late in his office just to avoid the uncomfortable atmosphere waiting for him at home. Other times he sat alone inside his car for long periods before entering the house. Deep inside, he knew he had destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him. He missed Chisom more every single day. He missed her calmness, her loyalty, her kindness, and the peace she brought into his life. Sometimes at night, he secretly looked through old pictures on his phone, pictures from their wedding, pictures of happy moments together. Each picture only increased his pain and regret. Meanwhile, people around Kenneth slowly started hearing rumors about what happened between him, Chisom, and Agnes. At first, only a few people knew the story, but as time passed, the secret spread little by little. Some people heard the story through mutual friends, others heard it through neighbors or co-workers. The shocking nature of the betrayal made people talk about it everywhere. Whenever Kenneth entered certain places, conversations suddenly stopped. Some people looked at him with judgment and disgust. Others whispered behind his back. One afternoon at work, Kenneth entered the office kitchen to make coffee. Two female colleagues who were talking quietly suddenly became silent when they saw him. Kenneth noticed immediately. One of them forced an awkward smile. "Good afternoon." Kenneth nodded slightly. "Afternoon." As he prepared his coffee quietly, he overheard one of them whisper softly after he walked away, "That's him." The other woman replied quietly, "The one that slept with his wife's mother?" Kenneth froze briefly after hearing those words. Pain and shame entered his chest immediately. He walked away quickly, pretending not to hear them, but deep inside, he felt humiliated. Everywhere he went now, he carried shame with him. Some of his friends slowly distanced themselves from him too. People who once respected him now looked at him differently. Kenneth began isolating himself from social gatherings because he could no longer handle the silent judgment from people around him. One Friday evening after work, Kenneth stopped at a restaurant alone to eat dinner. He sat quietly at a corner table, trying to avoid attention. As he waited for his food, somebody suddenly called his name. "Kenneth?" Kenneth looked up and saw a beautiful woman standing nearby, smiling in surprise. It took him a few seconds before he recognized her. "Ebube," he said slowly. The woman laughed happily. "Wow, it's really you." Kenneth stood up and smiled faintly for the first time in days. It's been a long time. Years ago, Kenneth and Ebube worked briefly together before she changed jobs. They were never very close, but they always got along well. Ebube was beautiful, confident, and cheerful. Kenneth remembered that many men admired her back then. Ebube smiled warmly. "Can I sit?" Kenneth nodded politely. "Of course." Ebube sat down across from him. "You've changed," she said while studying his face carefully. Kenneth forced a weak smile. "Life." Ebube laughed softly. "That serious?" Kenneth shrugged. "Something like that." Ebube noticed the sadness in his eyes immediately. "You look stressed." Kenneth sighed softly. "I've been through a lot." Ebube shook her head sympathetically. "Sorry about that." They talked for a long time that evening. Ebube shared stories about her new job and life experiences. Kenneth also spoke a little about work, though he carefully avoided mentioning his marriage problems. For the first time in many months, Kenneth felt slightly relaxed around someone. Ebube had a cheerful energy that made conversations easy and comfortable. Before leaving, Ebube smiled warmly. "It was nice seeing you again." Kenneth nodded. "Same here." Ebube hesitated briefly before speaking again. "Maybe we can hang out sometime." Kenneth smiled faintly. "I'd like that." They exchanged numbers and left separately. Over the next few weeks, Kenneth and Ebube started talking regularly. Sometimes they chatted on the phone at night. Other times they met for lunch or coffee after work. Ebube's presence slowly became a distraction from the chaos and regret in Kenneth's life. Whenever he was with her, he temporarily forgot the painful reality waiting for him at home. One evening, while they sat together at a quiet lounge, Ebube looked at Kenneth carefully and smiled. "You know, you are not as serious as I thought you were." Kenneth laughed softly. "You thought I was boring?" Ebube laughed too. "A little." Kenneth shook his head playfully. "Wow." Ebube smiled warmly. "Honestly, I enjoy talking to you." Kenneth looked at her quietly. "I enjoy talking to you too." Ebube studied his face carefully. But something still feels heavy inside you. Kenneth sighed softly. I'm trying to move on from some mistakes. Ebube nodded gently. Everybody makes mistakes. Kenneth looked away briefly. Not mistakes like mine. Ebube frowned slightly. What happened? Kenneth hesitated. It's complicated. Ebube smiled softly. I'm listening. Kenneth remained silent for a few seconds before speaking carefully. My marriage ended badly. Ebube looked surprised. You were married? Kenneth nodded slowly. Yes. Ebube looked sympathetic. Sorry about that. Kenneth sighed deeply. It's my fault. Ebube frowned slightly. What happened? Kenneth looked uncomfortable immediately. I'd rather not talk about it yet. Ebube nodded respectfully. Okay. Despite his hesitation, their friendship continued growing slowly. Ebube genuinely liked Kenneth and believed he was simply a man recovering from heartbreak. She admired how calm and mature he appeared around her. Unknown to her, the terrible truth about Kenneth's past was waiting quietly to destroy everything. One afternoon, Ebube visited a salon after work. While waiting for her hair appointment, she overheard two women discussing a shocking story nearby. Can you imagine, one woman said loudly, sleeping with your wife's mother? The second woman gasped dramatically. That is evil. Ebube was not paying attention at first until she suddenly heard Kenneth's name. The man's name is Kenneth, one woman continued, and the mother got pregnant for him. Ebube froze immediately. Her heart skipped. Slowly, she turned toward the women. Excuse me, she said carefully. The women looked at her. Ebube swallowed hard. What Kenneth are you talking about? One woman quickly explained the entire scandal excitedly, mentioning Chisom, Agnes, the pregnancy, and how the marriage collapsed. With every word she heard, her face slowly changed from confusion to shock and disgust. No, she whispered faintly. It can't be. But deep inside, she already knew it was the same Kenneth. That evening, Ebube called Kenneth immediately. We need to talk. Kenneth sensed the coldness in her voice immediately. Is everything okay? Ebube replied sharply. Just meet me. They agreed to meet at a quiet restaurant. The moment Kenneth arrived and saw Ebube's serious face, his heart sank immediately. Ebube, he said carefully. Ebube looked at him with disappointment and disgust. So, it's true. Kenneth froze. What? Ebube folded her arms angrily. You slept with your wife's mother. Silence filled the space between them immediately. Kenneth closed his eyes briefly because he knew there was no point denying it anymore. Ebube shook her head slowly in disbelief. Oh my God. Kenneth sighed heavily. Ebube, please let me explain. Ebube stood up immediately. Explain what? Her voice became louder. That you betrayed your wife with her own mother? People nearby started looking toward them. Kenneth lowered his voice quickly. Please, calm down. Ebube laughed bitterly. Calm down? She pointed angrily at him. You are disgusting. Kenneth looked ashamed. I know I made terrible mistakes. Ebube shook her head repeatedly. No, this is beyond mistakes. Kenneth sighed painfully. Things became complicated. Ebube scoffed angrily. Complicated? She looked at him with complete disgust. You are evil. Kenneth lowered his eyes in shame. Ebube continued angrily. And you sat with me pretending to be a good man. Kenneth whispered softly. I never pretended. Ebube laughed bitterly. You hid the truth. Kenneth sighed deeply. I was ashamed. Ebube pointed at him sharply, as you should be. People around them continued staring openly now. Kenneth felt deeply humiliated. Ebube grabbed her handbag angrily. Stay away from me. Kenneth stood up quickly. Ebube, please. Ebube stepped back immediately. Don't call me again. Then she walked away angrily, leaving Kenneth standing there alone while people around whispered and stared at him openly. Kenneth slowly sat back down feeling completely broken and ashamed. In that painful moment, the full consequences of his actions finally hit him completely. He had lost his wife, destroyed a family, lost respect, lost peace, and now even the possibility of starting over with someone else had collapsed because of the shame attached to his name. For the first time in his life, Kenneth truly understood that some actions leave scars too deep to hide, and the public shame and isolation surrounding him became a painful reminder of the terrible choices he made. As time continued to pass, Agnes's life slowly became more miserable and painful than she ever imagined. The excitement and false happiness she once believed she found with Kenneth disappeared completely, leaving behind only regret, shame, and loneliness. The relationship that destroyed her bond with her daughter was already falling apart before her eyes. Kenneth no longer treated her with affection or care. Most times, he avoided her completely. Sometimes, he left the house early and returned very late at night without explanation. Other times, he ignored her calls and messages for hours. The love and sweet words that once made Agnes feel desired disappeared completely. In their place came silence, coldness, frustration, and regret. One evening, Agnes sat quietly in the sitting room waiting for Kenneth. The food she prepared had already become cold on the table. She looked tired and weak. Her pregnancy had changed her appearance greatly. The woman who once dressed confidently and proudly now looked stressed and worn out. Her face no longer carried peace. Around 10 p.m., Kenneth finally entered the house looking exhausted. Agnes stood up immediately. "You are just coming back?" Kenneth dropped his bag carelessly. "Yes." Agnes frowned sadly. "I called you many times." Kenneth sighed heavily. "I was busy." Agnes moved closer. "Busy doing what?" Kenneth looked irritated immediately. "Agnes, please, I'm tired." Agnes folded her arms slowly. "You don't even spend time at home anymore." Kenneth laughed bitterly. "What exactly is left in this house?" Agnes's eyes filled with tears immediately. "So now I am your regret?" Kenneth looked away silently. Agnes's voice became emotional. "You promised me we would face everything together." Kenneth sighed loudly. "Agnes, please stop repeating that." Agnes pointed angrily. "You made me destroy my relationship with my daughter." Kenneth suddenly snapped. "And you think I didn't destroy my own life too?" Silence filled the room immediately. Agnes stared at him painfully. Kenneth rubbed his face tiredly. "I'm exhausted." Then he walked straight into the bedroom, leaving Agnes standing alone in tears again. That night, Agnes sat quietly in darkness for a long time thinking about her life. Everything she once had was gone. She lost her daughter, lost her dignity, lost her peace, and now even Kenneth was slipping away from her completely. Slowly, reality began hitting her harder every day. A few months later, things became even worse. Kenneth eventually moved out of the house completely after constant arguments between them. He claimed he needed space to think about his life. Agnes begged him not to leave, but Kenneth no longer cared. One afternoon, while he packed some clothes into a traveling bag, Agnes stood beside him crying helplessly. "Please don't leave me like this," she begged. Kenneth avoided her eyes. "I can't continue living like this." Agnes held his arm desperately. "What about me? What about the baby?" Kenneth pulled his hand away gently. "I will support the child financially." Agnes shook her head in pain. "I don't need only money." Kenneth sighed heavily. "Agnes, there's no peace here anymore." Tears rolled heavily down Agnes's cheeks. "You promised me forever." Kenneth laughed bitterly. "We built this relationship on betrayal. What exactly did we expect?" Agnes became silent immediately because deep inside she knew he was right. Kenneth carried his bag and walked toward the door. Agnes followed him desperately. "Please don't abandon me." Kenneth paused briefly without turning back. "I already abandoned myself the day I betrayed Chisom." Then he walked out of the house, leaving Agnes standing there broken and alone. After Kenneth left, Agnes's life became very difficult. The money Kenneth sent occasionally was never enough to cover all her needs. People around her also avoided her because of the scandal. Some neighbors whispered whenever they saw her outside. Others openly insulted her behind her back. Agnes became ashamed of going out. Most times, she stayed indoors crying quietly. After some months, she lost the baby due to stress and emotional pain. That loss completely broke her emotionally. She cried bitterly in the hospital after the doctor confirmed it. "Maybe this is my punishment," she whispered painfully to herself. Life became harder every day. Eventually, Agnes no longer afforded the expensive apartment Kenneth rented before leaving. She was forced to move into a smaller place in a poor neighborhood. The once proud woman who dressed beautifully and confidently now struggled just to survive. Because she needed money desperately, Agnes finally accepted work at a small local restaurant owned by an elderly woman. The work was stressful and humiliating for her. Every morning, she woke up very early, cleaned tables, washed plates, served food, and stood for long hours despite her weak health. Sometimes, customers shouted at her rudely. Other times, younger workers mocked her quietly behind her back. Agnes endured everything silently because she had no other choice. One afternoon at the restaurant, Agnes stood behind the sink washing dirty plates while sweat covered her face. Her hands looked rough and tired. The restaurant owner walked toward her. "Agnes, clean table 4 quickly." Agnes nodded quietly. "Okay, ma." As she wiped her hands tiredly and moved toward the dining area, she suddenly froze completely. Sitting quietly at one of the tables was Chisom. For a moment, Agnes thought she was imagining things, but it was truly her daughter. Chisom looked more mature and calmer now. She was dressed beautifully and carried herself with confidence again. Sitting beside her was Chinedu. They were talking quietly and smiling softly at each other. The moment Agnes saw her daughter, tears immediately filled her eyes. Her heart began beating fast with shame and regret. She quickly turned her face away, hoping Chisom would not notice her. But it was already too late. Chisom had seen her. For a few seconds, mother and daughter stared at each other silently across the restaurant. Agnes felt deep shame immediately. She looked nothing like the confident woman she once was. Her clothes looked old and faded. Her face looked tired and weak. Chisum's expression remained calm, but deep sadness briefly flashed in her eyes. Chinedu noticed the sudden silence and looked toward Agnes curiously. "Do you know her?" he asked softly. Chisum swallowed hard before replying quietly, "That's my mother." Chinedu became silent immediately. Agnes lowered her head quickly and hurried back toward the kitchen area. Her hands trembled badly as tears rolled down her cheeks. She could not believe her daughter had seen her in such condition. Meanwhile, Chinedu looked at Chisom carefully. "Are you okay?" Chisom nodded slowly. "Yes." But deep inside, seeing her mother like that stirred painful emotions inside her heart again. Chinedu held her hand gently. "If you want to leave, we can." Chisom shook her head softly. "No, it's okay." Although she remained calm outside, her heart felt heavy. She never imagined her mother's life would fall so low. After some minutes, Chisom and Chinedu finished eating. Chinedu paid the bill and they both stood up to leave. As they walked toward the exit, Agnes watched secretly from the kitchen entrance with tears in her eyes. Part of her wanted to run to Chisom immediately, but shame held her back. She watched silently as her daughter walked calmly away without saying a word to her. The pain of that moment pierced Agnes deeply. The following evening, Agnes could no longer bear the guilt and regret inside her heart. She gathered courage and went to Chisom's fashion shop after asking around for the address. When she arrived, she stood outside for several minutes, feeling nervous and ashamed. Finally, she entered slowly. One of the workers approached her politely. "Good evening, ma." Agnes nodded weakly. "I want to see Chisom." The worker pointed quietly toward the office area. "She's inside." Agnes walked slowly toward the office with trembling hands. When she entered, Chisom looked up from her desk and froze immediately. Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Agnes looked at her daughter with tears already gathering in her eyes. "Chisom," she whispered painfully. Chisom remained calm and expressionless. Agnes slowly moved closer. "Please don't send me away." Chisom finally spoke calmly. "Why are you here?" Agnes burst into tears immediately. "I came to beg you." Chisom looked down briefly before asking quietly, "Beg me for what?" Agnes cried helplessly. "Forgiveness." Chisom became silent again. Agnes continued painfully. "I know I destroyed everything." Tears rolled heavily down her face. "I know I failed you as a mother." Chisom looked at her quietly without speaking. Agnes wiped her tears weakly. "Every day of my life now is filled with regret." Chisom's face remained calm, but her eyes slowly became emotional. Agnes moved closer carefully. "My daughter, I'm suffering." Chisom finally spoke softly. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" Agnes lowered her head in shame. "Nothing." Tears continued falling from her eyes. "I just wanted you to know that I am truly sorry." Chisom looked away quietly. Agnes continued painfully. "I was selfish. I was foolish. I allowed temporary emotions destroy the most important relationship in my life." Chisom swallowed hard but remained silent. Agnes cried softly. "There is no peace in my life anymore." Chisom finally looked at her again. "You should have thought about that before sleeping with my husband." Agnes nodded weakly. "You are right." Chisom's eyes became watery now. Agnes continued softly. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." Chisom remained quiet for several seconds before finally speaking calmly. "The damage is already done." Agnes lowered her head slowly because she knew those words were true. Some wounds cut too deep to heal completely. And standing there in front of her daughter, broken by regret and shame, Agnes finally understood the full weight of the terrible choices she made. Life slowly moved forward after the painful meeting between Chisom and her mother at the fashion shop. Although the wounds inside Chisom's heart had not completely disappeared, she no longer allowed the pain control her life the way it once did. Little by little, she began rebuilding herself again. The woman who once cried endlessly inside a lonely hotel room slowly became stronger emotionally. Some days were still difficult. Some nights she still remembered the betrayal and cried quietly alone. But unlike before, those painful memories no longer destroyed her completely. Chinedu's presence in her life became one of the biggest reasons she found strength again. Throughout everything, Chinedu remained patient, calm, caring, and understanding. He never pressured her. He never judged her. Instead, he supported her gently while allowing her heal at her own pace. One evening, after closing from work, Chisom sat quietly inside her office while looking through some fashion sketches. Chinedu entered carrying food packs and smiled warmly. "Madame Designer," he said playfully. Chisom laughed softly. "You are here again." Chinedu nodded proudly. "And I brought food because I know you probably forgot to eat." Chisom smiled warmly. "You know me too well." Chinedu placed the food on the table and sat opposite her. "How was work today?" Chisom sighed softly but smiled. "Stressful but good." Chinedu nodded. "That means business is growing." Chisom smiled proudly. "Yes, I got another contract today." Chinedu clapped happily. "That's my hardworking woman." Chisom shook her head while laughing softly. "You always know how to make me smile." Chinedu looked at her carefully. "I like seeing you happy." Chisom became quiet for a moment before speaking softly. Thank you for not giving up on me. Chinedu frowned gently. Why would I? Chisom sighed. Most people would have walked away from someone with this kind of baggage. Chinedu shook his head slowly. Your pain does not reduce your value. Tears gathered lightly in Chisom's eyes. You really changed my life. Chinedu smiled warmly. No, you changed your own life. I only reminded you that you deserved happiness. Chisom smiled emotionally and looked away shyly. As months continued passing, Chisom's fashion business grew bigger than ever before. More customers came daily and her designs became very popular in Abuja. Social media influencers and wealthy women started wearing her clothes. Her small fashion brand slowly transformed into a respected business. Chisom employed more workers and even opened a bigger showroom in another part of the city. The same woman who once felt completely broken now stood stronger and more successful than before. One afternoon, during a fashion exhibition, several people gathered around Chisom admiring her designs. One woman smiled excitedly. Your work is beautiful. Chisom smiled politely. Thank you. Another customer added, I've been hearing about your brand everywhere. Chisom smiled proudly but humbly. I appreciate the support. Chinedu stood nearby watching her with pride shining in his eyes. One of the guests looked at Chinedu playfully. You must be very proud of her. Chinedu smiled warmly. Very proud. Chisom looked at him and smiled softly too. Their relationship continued growing naturally and peacefully. Unlike her marriage with Kenneth that later became filled with secrets and tension, her connection with Chinedu felt calm and genuine. They communicated honestly, they respected each other deeply. Chinedu constantly reminded Chisom that healthy love should bring peace, not confusion. One evening, while they sat together outside a quiet restaurant, Chinedu looked at Chisom seriously. Can I ask you something? Chisom smiled softly. What? Chinedu held her hand gently. Do you think your heart is finally healing? Chisom became thoughtful for a moment before answering honestly. I think the pain will always exist somewhere. Chinedu nodded slowly. That's understandable. Chisom continued softly. But I'm no longer drowning in it. Chinedu smiled gently. That's growth. Chisom looked at him emotionally. You helped me believe in life again. Chinedu squeezed her hand softly. You deserved that chance. Chisom smiled quietly. Some months later, Chisom finally completed her divorce process with Kenneth officially. The day she received the final divorce papers, she sat quietly in her office staring at them for a long time. The memories of her marriage flashed through her mind slowly. The love she once believed was forever, the betrayal that destroyed everything, the tears, the pain, the heartbreak. But strangely, instead of sadness, she felt peace, deep peace. She took a deep breath and whispered softly to herself, it's finally over. Later that evening, she met Chinedu and showed him the papers quietly. Chinedu looked at her carefully. How do you feel? Chisom smiled softly. Free. Chinedu nodded proudly. And you deserved that freedom. Chisom leant back quietly. I never thought I would survive everything that happened. Chinedu smiled gently. But you did. Chisom looked at him emotionally. Sometimes I still wonder why all those things happened to me. Chinedu remained silent for a moment before replying softly. Sometimes painful experiences teach us our strength. Chisom nodded slowly. I'm stronger now. Chinedu smiled warmly. Yes, you are. Meanwhile, Kenneth's life continued falling apart emotionally. Even though he still had his job, there was no peace inside him anymore. The shame of his actions followed him everywhere. People still whispered about the scandal whenever his name came up. Some old friends completely cut ties with him. Others only spoke to him formally without warmth or respect. Kenneth became lonely and isolated. Most evenings, he sat alone inside his apartment, drinking quietly while staring into space. He often thought about Chisom and the beautiful life he destroyed with his own hands. One night, while sitting alone, Kenneth looked at an old picture of Chisom smiling beside him happily. Tears gathered slowly in his eyes. I lost the best thing in my life, he whispered painfully. Deep regret consumed him daily. He tried speaking to different women after the scandal, but nothing ever worked out. Once people discovered the truth about his past, they quickly distanced themselves from him. The shame attached to his name became too heavy to escape. Sometimes, Kenneth visited places where he and Chisom once spent time together. Restaurants, parks, quiet roads they used to drive through together. Each place only reminded him of the happiness he threw away carelessly. One afternoon, Kenneth unexpectedly saw Chisom and Chinedu together at a shopping mall. Chisom looked happy, peaceful, and beautiful. Chinedu held her hand gently while they laughed together. Kenneth froze immediately when he saw them. For several seconds, he simply stood there staring silently. Chisom also noticed him. Their eyes met briefly. Kenneth's heart became heavy with regret instantly. But unlike before, Chisom no longer looked broken or angry. She simply looked calm and healed. Chinedu noticed Kenneth too and looked at Chisom carefully. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Chisom nodded calmly. "Yes." Kenneth slowly walked closer awkwardly. "Chisom," he said quietly. Chisom looked at him calmly. "Hello, Kenneth." Kenneth swallowed hard. "You look well." Chisom nodded politely. "Thank you." Kenneth looked down briefly before speaking again. "I just wanted to say, I'm truly sorry for everything." Chisom remained silent for a few seconds. Then she finally replied calmly, "I already accepted what happened." Kenneth looked emotional. "I still regret it every day." Chisom nodded softly. "Some mistakes change lives forever." Kenneth lowered his head in shame. Chinedu stood quietly beside her respectfully. Kenneth looked at Chinedu briefly and sighed painfully. "You're lucky." Chinedu replied calmly, "I know." Kenneth nodded sadly. "Take good care of her." Chinedu answered softly, "I will." Kenneth looked at Chisom one final time with deep regret before walking away slowly. As he disappeared into the crowd, Chisom remained quiet for a moment. Chinedu squeezed her hand gently. "Are you okay?" Chisom smiled softly. "Yes." Then she looked at Chinedu and added quietly, "I finally found peace." Chinedu smiled warmly. "And you deserve it." Some months later, Chinedu proposed to Chisom during a quiet dinner celebration, surrounded by close friends and loved ones. Chisom became emotional immediately when he brought out the ring. "Chisom," Chinedu said while holding her hand, "you went through pain nobody deserved, but you still remained kind, strong, and beautiful inside. I want to spend the rest of my life making you smile again. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Chisom's eyes instantly. This time, they were not tears of pain, they were tears of healing and happiness. She smiled warmly and nodded. Yes. Everybody around them clapped happily while Chinedu gently placed the ring on her finger. Chisom looked at him emotionally and whispered softly, "Thank you for helping me believe in love again." Chinedu smiled gently. Real love brings peace, not destruction. And finally, after all the betrayal, heartbreak, shame, and pain she survived, Chisom truly found happiness again. Her journey became a powerful lesson about trust, betrayal, consequences, healing, and the strength to start over, no matter how broken life once seemed. This story teaches that betrayal can destroy relationships, families, trust, and peace completely. No matter how tempting wrong actions may seem at the beginning, anything built on lies and betrayal will eventually bring pain, shame, regret, and suffering. It also teaches that people should never take genuine love and loyalty for granted, because good relationships are rare and valuable. Most importantly, the story shows that no matter how painful life becomes, healing is possible. A broken person can rise again, find peace, rebuild their life, and become stronger than before. True happiness comes from honesty, respect, patience, and making the right choices. Thanks for watching this amazing story on African Stories by V. If you liked it and felt inspired, please show your support by clicking the like button, sharing with your friends, and leaving a comment below. To see more interesting stories and learn about different cultures, subscribe to African Stories by V. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories to you. Until we meet again, stay connected, stay inspired, and keep smiling.